Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It was one of those nights where the forest feels too quiet, like the trees are holding their breath. I had been out here countless times before, but tonight felt different. You know that gut feeling, the kind that creeps in and sits heavy on your chest? It was one of those nights and my gut was screaming. I've been a park ranger in the Rockies for over a decade, and not much spooks me anymore. I've seen everything from reckless campers to bears with a bad attitude, but this was something else. The radio call had come in earlier that afternoon, routine enough. Some hikers reported strange noises, something they described as inhuman screams, coming from a trail far off the beaten path. I'd been sent to check it out, the lucky one with the most experience handling the weird stuff. "Don't sweat it, John," I muttered to myself as I hiked up the trail. It was a path barely used by anyone, overgrown with brambles and trees that leaned over it like they had something to hide. Probably a cougar or some animal messing with the tourists. Always is. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The sun was sinking fast, the kind of late autumn evening where daylight bleeds out of the sky too soon, and the air turns sharp. I had another hour before it got completely dark, and even though I'd packed a flashlight and my radio was still chirping back at headquarters, the growing shadows were making me nervous. I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The trail started to narrow, the trees closing in tight on either side. The deeper I went, the less familiar everything seemed. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but this section felt off, like it had been forgotten. I caught sight of something on the ground. Tracks, deep ones, fresh in the mud. But they weren't human. And they weren't bare either. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knelt down, running my fingers along the edge of one of the prints. It was large, too large, and had this odd shape, almost like a wolf but elongated, stretched out in a way that didn't make sense. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. No birds, no wind. Just the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant echo of my own breathing. I stood up slowly, heart starting to pound a little harder. There was no way I was alone out here. That's when I heard it. The scream. It sliced through the silence like a blade, high-pitched, piercing, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a cougar. It wasn't any animal I knew. The sound rattled through the trees, bouncing off the rocks, and it was close. I gripped the radio on my belt, raising it to my mouth. "HQ, this is Ranger John. Do you copy?" Static. "HQ, repeat, do you copy?" Nothing. The sun dipped below the horizon, the last rays of light bleeding out into the purples and blacks of twilight. The trail was barely visible now, just a dark thread through the woods. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting a path through the trees. The scream came again, this time closer, too close. I froze. My flashlight caught movement in the trees ahead, just a flicker, something large moving through the underbrush. My breath caught in my throat. Whatever it was fast, and it was circling me. I swung the beam of my light, catching only glimpses, shadows shifting, branches snapping under the weight of something much heavier than a deer. "Who's there?" I shouted into the dark, my voice cracking with a fear I wasn't ready to admit. Silence for a heartbeat. Then a low growl. It vibrated in the air, deep and guttural, so close that I felt it more than I heard it. I backed up, scanning the tree line with the flashlight, my hand instinctively going to the knife on my belt. I knew I couldn't outrun whatever this was. I was in its territory now, and it was letting me know. That's when I saw them, eyes reflecting the light from my beam, low to the ground but wide apart. The creature was crouched in the underbrush, watching me. Its eyes shone a sickly yellow, and they didn't blink, didn't move. They just stared, locked onto me like a predator sizing up its prey. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to stand my ground. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't natural. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but the fear was too thick, clouding my judgment. Then the eyes disappeared, swallowed by the darkness as the thing shifted, moving again. This time, I heard it. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, crushing the earth beneath it as it moved just out of sight, circling, always circling. I turned with it, trying to keep the flashlight trained on where I thought it would reappear. My pulse hammered in my ears. It was toying with me. Suddenly a branch snapped behind me, too close. I whipped around, the flashlight swinging wildly, catching a glimpse of fur, thick, dark, matted fur. My stomach dropped. The creature stood up, slowly, rising from the undergrowth, towering over me. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, standing on 2 legs like a man, but with a shape that was all wrong. Broad shoulders, long arms that hung too low, and that face. I didn't get a good look, but it was enough. My brain screamed, "Dogman," though I didn't believe in that stuff. I still don't. The growl came again, low and menacing, rumbling from its chest. My legs felt like jelly, but I didn't run. Running would only make it chase. That much I knew. I backed up slowly, flashlight still trained on the beast. My radio crackled finally. "Ranger John, this is HQ. Do you copy?" I fumbled for it, bringing it to my mouth without taking my eyes off the creature. "I copy," I whispered, voice shaking. "I need backup, now." Static. The thing shifted, its massive head tilting as if it understood what I was saying. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, calculating, waiting for me to make the wrong move. My hand hovered over the knife, but what good would a knife do against something like this? I was outmatched, out of my depth, and very, very alone. The creature's lips curled back, revealing long, sharp teeth that glistened in the beam of my flashlight. It stepped forward, just 1 step, testing me. I forced myself to move, taking slow, measured steps backward, never turning my back on it. The trail was narrow, and I could hear my own footsteps crunching on the gravel, each step feeling like a countdown. The creature let out a sound, a mix between a growl and a laugh, as if amused by my pitiful attempt to escape. My hand tightened around the radio, heart racing, if backup didn't arrive soon. "Ranger John, do you copy?" HQ's voice came again, but the static was overpowering. I couldn't get a clear signal. My breath hitched as the creature took another step forward, muscles rippling under its fur. I was going to die out here. The thing lunged. Instinct took over. I dropped the flashlight, grabbed the knife, and swung blindly as it came at me. The blade connected with something solid, flesh. The creature roared, a sound that rattled through the trees, but I didn't wait to see what damage I had done. I turned and bolted, my legs carrying me faster than I thought possible down the trail, heart pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, furious, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. It was faster, but the trail was narrow, and the trees gave me cover. I zigzagged, ducking under branches, my lungs burning. I didn't dare look back. The trail opened up into a clearing, and I saw my truck parked at the edge, like a beacon of safety. I sprinted the last few yards, throwing myself into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut, just as something massive crashed into the side of the vehicle. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking as the truck rocked from side to side, the thing outside slamming against the doors with its massive body. Finally, the engine roared to life. I floored it, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the mountain road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, my heart still racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I stumbled out of the truck, legs trembling, and collapsed against the hood. HQ's voice crackled through the radio again. "Ranger John, do you copy?" I pressed the button, voice barely a whisper. "I copy." I didn't tell them everything. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. But I knew one thing for sure. There's something out there in those woods, something big, something dangerous, and it's watching. Story 2. I've been a ranger for 20 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night in Shadowpine Forest. The memory still sends chills down my spine, making me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness I've dedicated my life to protecting. It was a crisp autumn evening when I received the call. Campers at Site 17 reported strange noises and something large moving around their campsite after dark. Typically, these calls turn out to be nothing more than a curious black bear or an overactive imagination fueled by campfire stories. But there was an urgency in the camper's voice that made me take it seriously. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, radio and tranquilizer gun, just in case. The drive to Campsite 17 took about 30 minutes along winding forest roads. As I neared the area, I noticed an unusual silence. The normal chorus of crickets and nightbirds was eerily absent. Pulling up to the campsite, I saw a family of 4 huddled around a dying campfire. Their faces were etched with worry as I approached. "Evening, folks. I'm Ranger John. What seems to be the problem?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light and reassuring. The father, a tall man with graying hair, stepped forward. "Thanks for coming, Ranger. We've been hearing something out there. It's big, whatever it is. Bigger than any bear I've ever encountered." I nodded, taking mental notes. "Can you describe what you heard?" The mother chimed in, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was like heavy breathing and footsteps, but not like an animal on 4 legs. It sounded, I know this sounds crazy, but it sounded like it was walking on 2 legs. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept my face neutral. "I see. And how long ago did you last hear these noises?" "About an hour ago," the father replied. "It seemed to be circling the campsite, but never came into view. We've been too scared to leave the fire since." I assured them I'd investigate and asked them to stay put. As I moved towards the edge of the clearing, I swept my flashlight across the underbrush. The beam caught something that made me pause. A branch snapped clean off a tree about 8 feet up. Whatever did that had to be tall and strong. I pushed deeper into the forest, all senses on high alert. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots. About 50 yards from the campsite, I found the first track. My breath caught in my throat. The print was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. It was vaguely human-shaped, but with claw marks at the end of each toe. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years as a ranger. I radioed back to base, keeping my voice low. "This is Ranger John at Campsite 17. I found some unusual tracks, requesting backup for a full sweep of the area in the morning." As I waited for a response, a twig snapped somewhere to my left. I whirled, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second I caught a glimpse of something that defied explanation. It was tall, at least 8 feet, and covered in dark fur. But it wasn't a bear. It stood on 2 legs, its body a bizarre mixture of human and animal features. Before I could process what I was seeing, it melted back into the shadows with surprising agility for its size. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away slowly, keeping my light trained on the spot where I'd seen the creature. The radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Copy that, Ranger John. Backup will be there at first light. Do you require immediate assistance?" I hesitated. What could I say? That I'd seen some cryptid creature straight out of a campfire tale? I'd be laughed out of the service. "Negative," I replied. "Situation is under control. I'll stay with the campers until morning." I made my way back to the campsite, my mind racing. The family looked relieved to see me, but their expressions changed when they saw my face. "Did you find anything?" the father asked. I chose my words carefully. "I found some unusual tracks. It's probably just a large black bear, but I've called for backup to do a thorough sweep in the morning. For now, I think it's best if you pack up and follow me back to the ranger station for the night." They didn't argue. Within minutes, we were in our vehicles heading back to safety. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from the dark forest on either side of the road. Back at the station, I got the family settled in our visitor cabin and retreated to my office. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night poring over reports of unusual sightings in the area, finding more than I expected. Most had been dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but now I wasn't so sure. As the first light of dawn broke, I heard vehicles pulling up outside. The backup team had arrived. I met them in the parking lot, where they were unloading gear for the sweep. "So, John, what exactly are we looking for out there?" asked Mike, a seasoned ranger I'd worked with for years. I took a deep breath. "Honestly, Mike, I'm not sure. The tracks I found, they're like nothing I've ever seen before," and I hesitated, then decided to tell him everything. "I saw something out there, something big, walking on two legs. It wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't human." Mike's eyebrows shot up. "You're not messing with us, are you? Because if this is some kind of hazing for the new guys—" "I wish I was," I said solemnly. "Look, I know how it sounds. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. But something's out there, and we need to figure out what it is before someone gets hurt." The sweep took all day. We combed through every inch of the forest surrounding Campsite 17. We found more tracks, similar to the ones I'd seen the night before. There were claw marks on trees, some disturbingly high up. But of the creature itself, we found no sign. As the sun began to set, we regrouped at the campsite. The mood was tense. Even the skeptics among us had been shaken by what we'd found. "So what do we do now?" one of the younger rangers asked. I sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. "We keep this quiet for now. No need to start a panic. We'll increase patrols in the area and set up some trail cameras. Whatever this thing is, we need to document it properly before we go public." As we packed up to leave, I took one last look at the forest. The shadows seemed deeper somehow, hiding secrets I was no longer sure I wanted to uncover. I'd always thought I knew these woods, but now I realized how little I truly understood about the wilderness and what might be lurking in its darkest corners. In the weeks that followed, we never got a clear sighting of the creature again. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I swear I can hear something moving out there in the darkness. Something big, something that shouldn't exist, and I wonder what else might be hiding in the shadows of Shadow Pine Forest. Story 3. I've been a park ranger for 15 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things in these woods, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in October. It was the kind of encounter that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the natural world. The day started like any other. I woke up at dawn, had my usual black coffee, and headed out for my morning patrol. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and impending winter. As I drove through the winding roads of the national park, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the animals more skittish. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that I received the first report. A group of hikers had come across some unusual tracks near Beaver Creek Campground. They described them as massive and unlike anything they'd ever seen. Normally, I'd chalk it up to inexperienced campers misidentifying bear or elk tracks, but something in their voices made me take notice. I decided to check it out myself. As I approached the campground, the sun was already dipping below the tree line, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The campground was mostly empty this time of year, with only a few hardy souls braving the cold nights. I found the tracks easily enough. They were exactly as the hikers had described. Enormous, easily twice the size of a bear print, with distinct claw marks at the tips. What struck me most was the depth of the impressions. Whatever made these tracks was incredibly heavy. I knelt down to examine them more closely, running my fingers along the edges. That's when I felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I stood up slowly, my hand instinctively moving to the holster on my hip. The forest had gone deathly quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I scanned the tree line, my eyes straining in the fading light. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement between two ancient pines. My breath caught in my throat. For a split second, I glimpsed a dark shape, massive and hunched, before it melted back into the shadows. It moved with a fluidity that defied its size, more like a shadow than a solid creature. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the stillness. "This is Ranger Mike. Is anyone there?" No response, just the growing darkness and that feeling of being watched. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. As I swept it across the trees, I caught a flash of eyes reflecting back at me, 2 pinpricks of light, far higher off the ground than any normal animal. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Every instinct told me to run, to get back to my truck and call for backup. But I couldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, transfixed by those eyes in the darkness. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. The sound vibrated in my chest, raising the hair on my arms. That's when the rational part of my brain finally kicked in. I started backing away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd seen the creature. My hand was on my radio, ready to call for help, but what would I even say? That I'd seen some kind of monster in the woods? As I retreated, I heard the snap of branches and the rustle of underbrush. Whatever it was moving, following me. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching on fallen leaves. The sounds behind me grew louder, more urgent. I could hear heavy breathing now, getting closer with each passing second. I broke into a run, abandoning all pretense of calm. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as I sprinted through the trees, branches whipping at my face. I could hear it pursuing me, its footfalls heavy and fast. My truck was just ahead, parked on the access road. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them. As I reached the vehicle, I risked a glance over my shoulder. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. It stood at the edge of the clearing, a massive silhouette against the darkening sky. It must have been 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. But it was the eyes that got me, glowing with an unnatural intelligence, fixed directly on me. I practically dove into the truck, slamming the door behind me. My fingers felt numb as I tried to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the darkness. That's when it stepped into the light. For a brief moment I saw it clearly, covered in dark, matted fur. A face that was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. Hands, or were they paws, with long, curved claws. Our eyes met, and in that instant I felt something I can't quite explain, a sense of ancient wisdom, of primordial power, and something else, a warning. This was its territory, and I was the intruder. I slammed the truck into reverse, tires spinning on the gravel as I backed away. The creature watched me go, unmoving, until I turned onto the main road and sped away into the night. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a product of an overactive imagination. But I knew better. The tracks, the sounds, the undeniable presence I'd felt, it was all too real. When I reached the station, I sat in my truck for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. I knew I should report what had happened, but who would believe me? I'd worked hard to build a reputation as a level-headed, reliable ranger. One report of a monster in the woods could undo all of that. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself, at least for now. I filed a report about unusual tracks and recommended increased patrols in the area. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all I could manage. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes watching me from the darkness. I knew that whatever I'd encountered out there, it was still in those woods, waiting, watching. The next few weeks were tense. I found myself jumping at shadows, startling at every snap twig or rustle of leaves. I volunteered for extra patrols in the area where I'd had my encounter, driven by a mix of fear and fascination. I never saw the creature again, not clearly. But there were signs, more tracks, tufts of coarse hair caught on tree bark, and once a half-eaten deer carcass that had been dragged into a small cave. And always that feeling of being watched. The other rangers noticed my change in behavior. They'd catch me staring off into the trees, lost in thought. A few times, I almost told them what I'd seen, but I always stopped short. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? As the weeks turned to months, the incident began to feel more like a dream than a reality. I started to doubt my own memories. Had it really been as big as I remembered? Could I have mistaken a bear for something more sinister? But then I'd come across a fresh set of those massive tracks, or hear that low, rumbling growl echoing through the trees at dusk, and I'd know. It was out there, as real as the ground beneath my feet. I've spent countless hours researching since that night, poring over books on cryptozoology and local legends. I've heard whispers of similar encounters from other parks across the country. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, skunk ape, different names for what might be the same creature. Some nights when the moon is full and the forest is alive with shadows, I find myself drawn back to that spot near Beaver Creek. I'll stand there, listening to the night sounds, and wonder if it's watching me. I imagine it out there in the darkness, a guardian of ancient secrets, a reminder that there are still mysteries in this world. I don't know if I'll ever see it again, or if I even want to. But I do know this: those woods will never be the same for me. Every time I put on my ranger uniform and step into the forest, I'm acutely aware that I'm not at the top of the food chain. There are things out there, older and wilder than us, that defy our understanding of the natural world. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you might just catch a glimpse of them. Story 4. I've always found solace in the great outdoors. But after what happened that night in the Cascade Mountains, I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe in the wilderness again. It was supposed to be a simple solo camping trip, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. Instead, it became a nightmare that continues to haunt me to this day. My name's Mike, and I'm an avid outdoorsman. I've been camping and hiking since I was a kid, and I've always prided myself on being prepared for anything the wilderness might throw at me, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in those remote woods. It was late September, and the air had that crisp autumn feel to it. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the landscape in vibrant reds and golds. I had chosen a secluded spot, about a day's hike from the nearest ranger station. As I set up camp, I reveled in the solitude, the only sounds being the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional call of a distant bird. I spent the day exploring the area, taking photos of the stunning scenery and enjoying the peace that can only be found far from civilization. As night fell, I returned to my campsite, built a small fire, and settled in with a book and a cup of hot cocoa. The stars were incredibly bright, unpolluted by city lights, and I found myself gazing up at them in wonder. It must have been around midnight when I first noticed something was off. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, nothing. It was as if the entire wood was holding its breath. I sat up straighter, suddenly alert, my senses straining against the silence. That's when I heard it. A deep, heavy breathing coming from just beyond the circle of light cast by my dying campfire. My heart began to race as I slowly turned my head towards the sound. I couldn't see anything in the inky blackness, but I could feel a presence, something large and undeniably there. I reached for my flashlight with trembling hands, debating whether I should turn it on or if that would only provoke whatever was out there. Before I could decide, I heard movement. Something big was circling my campsite, just out of sight. The sound of twigs snapping under heavy feet sent shivers down my spine. Swallowing hard, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello? Is someone there?" The only response was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the sound of any animal I'd ever encountered before. It was almost human, but not quite. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd experienced before. I scrambled into my tent, zipping it up as if that flimsy barrier could protect me from whatever was out there. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? No, bears don't walk on two legs like that. A person playing a sick joke? But who could make those inhuman sounds? Throughout the night, I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, listening to the creature as it moved around my campsite. Sometimes it seemed to retreat, only to return moments later. I didn't dare look outside, afraid of what I might see, the sounds it made. Sometimes it was that heavy breathing, other times it was a sort of chittering noise that sent ice through my veins. And once, just once, I heard what sounded like words, but in no language I'd ever heard before. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, the noises finally stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, straining my ears for any sign that the creature was still there. Finally, when the sun was fully up, I gathered my courage and unzipped the tent. The campsite looked normal at first glance, but as I stepped out, I noticed things were not as I'd left them. My backpack, which I'd left by the fire, was now hanging from a tree branch, a branch that had to be at least 10 feet off the ground. How had it gotten up there? But that wasn't the most unsettling discovery. As I walked around the perimeter of my campsite, I found footprints. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own feet, and they seemed to be a strange mix of human and animal. The toes were elongated, ending in what looked like claw marks, and the shape of the foot was just wrong somehow. My hands shook as I took out my phone to photograph the prints. Part of me wanted to pretend this had all been a bad dream, but I knew I needed evidence. As I was snapping pictures, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. There were claw marks on several of the trees surrounding my campsite. Not low down like a bear might leave, but high up, some of them 8 or 9 feet off the ground. Whatever had been here last night, it was big, really big. I didn't waste any time packing up my gear. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. I felt eyes on me the entire time, watching from the dense forest. As I shouldered my pack and prepared to leave, I took one last look around. That's when I saw it. A tuft of coarse, dark hair caught on a thorny bush. With trembling fingers, I plucked it free and sealed it in a small plastic bag. More evidence. The hike back to civilization was the most terrifying journey of my life. Every shadow seemed to hide a monstrous shape, every sound a potential threat. I half ran most of the way, my pack bouncing painfully against my back. When I finally reached the ranger station, I must have looked like a madman, wild-eyed, out of breath, babbling about monsters in the woods. The rangers listened to my story with skeptical expressions. I could see they didn't believe me, thought I was just another camper spooked by normal forest sounds. But when I showed them the photos of the footprints and the hair sample, their attitudes changed. They exchanged worried glances and started asking more detailed questions about where exactly I'd been camping. One of the older rangers pulled me aside after I'd finished my report. "Son," he said, his voice low, "you're not the first person to come in here with a story like this. We don't like to talk about it much, but there's been incidents over the years, things we can't explain." He advised me to keep quiet about what I'd seen. "No one will believe you anyway," he said, "and you don't want the kind of attention this could bring." I left the ranger station feeling confused and unsettled. Part of me wanted to go to the media to tell everyone about what I'd encountered, but a larger part just wanted to forget it had ever happened. In the weeks that followed, I pored over books and websites about cryptids and unexplained phenomena. I found myself going down rabbit holes of Bigfoot sightings and theories about unknown primate species, but nothing quite matched what I had experienced. I sent the hair sample to a lab for DNA analysis, using a connection from my job as a biology teacher. When the results came back, they only deepened the mystery. The lab reported that the DNA was unlike anything in their database. It had similarities to primate DNA, but with significant unexplained variations. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out the window, thinking about what's really out there in the wilderness. I've always been a rational person, a man of science. But that night in the Cascades shook my understanding of the world to its core. I haven't been camping since that trip. The thought of sleeping in a tent, vulnerable to whatever might be lurking in the darkness, fills me with dread. But sometimes, when I look at the mountains in the distance, I feel a pull, a need to go back, to find answers, because I know it's out there, watching, waiting, and someday I might just be brave enough, or foolish enough, to go looking for it again. But for now, I'm content to let the mystery remain in the shadows of those ancient forests, where reality blurs and the impossible becomes terrifyingly real. Story 5. I've always found solace in the wilderness, but after what happened on that fateful hike, I'm not sure I'll ever feel the same way about the great outdoors again. It was supposed to be a simple day trip, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that continues to haunt my dreams. The morning started like any other. I woke up early, packed my day pack with water, trail mix and a first aid kit, and drove out to my favorite trailhead. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As I stepped out of my car, I took a deep breath, feeling the tension of the work week already starting to melt away. The trail was familiar, winding its way through dense forest and along babbling streams. I'd hiked it dozens of times before, but today felt different somehow. The forest seemed quieter, the shadows deeper. I shrugged off the feeling, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. It wasn't until I was about 3 miles in that I noticed something odd. The ground had grown muddy from recent rains, and there, pressed deep into the earth, was a footprint unlike any I'd ever seen. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, with distinct toe impressions and a depth that suggested incredible weight. I knelt down to examine it more closely, my heart beginning to race. This was no bear track, no print left by any animal I was familiar with. It looked almost human, but impossibly large. As I stood up, I noticed another print a few feet ahead, then another. They formed a clear trail, leading off into the underbrush. Against my better judgment, I found myself following them, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. The trail led me off the main path and into denser forest. The canopy above grew thicker, filtering out more and more sunlight. I should have turned back then, should have listened to the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach, but I pressed on, determined to solve this mystery. It wasn't until I glanced at my watch that I realized how much time had passed. The afternoon was waning, the forest growing darker by the minute. I looked up from the tracks, suddenly aware of how far I'd strayed from the main trail. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that was neither fully animal nor human. It echoed through the trees, raising the hair on the back of my neck. I froze, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for the source. The forest had gone eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just that oppressive quiet broken only by the pounding of my own heart. I took a step back, ready to retreat the way I'd come, when a twig snapped somewhere to my left. I whirled around, peering into the gathering gloom. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye. Something large was moving between the trees just at the edge of my vision. I caught a glimpse of dark fur, of a hulking shape that walked on two legs. Panic seized me. I turned and ran, no longer caring about direction or stealth. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear movement behind me, heavy footfalls and the cracking of branches. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like lead. When I finally stopped, bent double and gasping for air, I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest looked unfamiliar, the trees pressing in close on all sides. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of a new sound, a deep, rhythmic breathing that wasn't my own. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air around me. And with it came a smell, strong and musky, like wet fur and decay. I stood perfectly still, afraid that even the slightest movement would give away my position. The breathing grew louder, closer. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. Slowly, I reached for my phone, hoping against hope that I'd have signal out here. As I pulled it from my pocket, my fingers trembling, a twig snapped just behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, not 10 feet away, stood a figure that defied explanation. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and ape-like features, with deep-set eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. For a moment, we stared at each other, frozen in mutual shock. Then, it let out a roar that shook me to my very core. I didn't think, I just ran. I crashed through the forest blindly, branches tearing at my clothes, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear it behind me, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. The sound of breaking branches and heavy breathing spurred me on, pushing me past the limits of my endurance. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst through the tree line onto the main trail. Without pausing, I turned and sprinted towards where I thought I'd left my car, praying I was going in the right direction. The sounds of pursuit faded, but I didn't slow down. I ran until the parking lot came into view, my car a beacon of safety in the gathering dusk. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. As I slammed the door shut and started the engine, I finally allowed myself to look back. The forest loomed dark and silent, revealing nothing of what lurked within. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, tires squealing on gravel, I swear I saw a large, shadowy figure watching from the tree line. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a bear or some other known animal, but I knew that was a lie. What I'd encountered was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. In the days that followed, I wrestled with whether to report what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I'd sound crazy, ranting about giant fur-covered creatures in the woods. In the end, I kept it to myself, but the experience changed me. I couldn't sleep for weeks, jolting awake at every sound outside my window. I'd find myself staring into the trees at the edge of town, wondering if it was out there, watching. The worst part was the doubt. Had I really seen what I thought I saw, or had fear and exhaustion played tricks on my mind? It took months before I could bring myself to go hiking again. When I finally did, I stuck to popular, well-traveled trails, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow held potential danger, every unexpected sound sent my heart racing. I've spent countless hours since then researching, trying to find some explanation for what I encountered. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, about creatures like the Wendigo and the Sasquatch. I've connected with others who claim to have had similar experiences. Some of their stories are eerily similar to mine, describing the same overwhelming sense of being stalked by something ancient and powerful. There are nights when I lie awake, replaying every moment of that day in my mind. I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed to confront the creature, or if it had caught up to me in the forest. Would anyone have ever known what happened to me? The encounter has left me with more questions than answers. If such creatures exist, how have they remained hidden for so long? Are they some kind of undiscovered primate, or something stranger? And why did it let me go? I still go hiking occasionally, drawn by a mix of fear and fascination. Each time I find myself scanning the trees, looking for signs of large footprints or unusual movement. Part of me hopes to see it again, to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. Another part dreads the possibility. One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Those woods hold secrets, ancient and wild. We like to think we've tamed the natural world, that we understand all its mysteries. But my experience taught me otherwise. There are things out there just beyond the edge of firelight that defy our understanding. Things that remind us that we're not as removed from the primal world as we'd like to believe. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just stumble upon them. So the next time you're out in the wild, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, remember my story. Look carefully at the shadows between the trees. Listen for heavy breathing or footsteps that seem too large to be human. You might just catch a glimpse of something that will change your view of the world forever. Just be prepared to run. Story 6. I've captured countless images of wildlife over the years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw through my lens that day in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was an encounter that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and leave me questioning the very nature of reality. My name is Tom, and I'm a wildlife photographer. I've spent the better part of 2 decades trekking through some of the most remote wilderness areas on the planet, all in pursuit of that perfect shot. I've photographed everything from elusive snow leopards in the Himalayas to rarely seen deep-sea creatures, but it was in my own backyard, so to speak, where I encountered something that defied explanation. It was early October, and I had ventured deep into the heart of the Olympic National Forest. The autumn colors were at their peak, creating a stunning backdrop for wildlife photography. I'd heard rumors of an unusually large elk population in the area, and I was hoping to capture some impressive shots of the bulls during rutting season. I'd been in the forest for 3 days, camping in a small, unobtrusive tent, and spending my days hiking to various locations I'd scouted as potential hotspots for elk activity. On the 4th morning, I woke before dawn, as usual, and set out for a promising clearing about 2 miles from my campsite. The forest was shrouded in a light mist as I made my way through the undergrowth, my camera equipment a reassuring weight on my back. As I approached the clearing, I slowed my pace and moved as quietly as possible, not wanting to startle any wildlife that might be around. I set up my equipment at the edge of the clearing, hidden partially behind a large fallen log. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the trees, creating a magical, almost ethereal atmosphere. I settled in to wait, my camera at the ready. Hours passed with little activity beyond a few squirrels and the occasional bird. But as a wildlife photographer, patience is key. I knew that the most extraordinary moments often come when you least expect them. It was nearing midday when I first noticed something odd. The forest had gone unusually quiet. No bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if every living creature was holding its breath. I felt a prickle of unease run down my spine, but I pushed it aside, focusing instead on scanning the clearing through my camera's viewfinder. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a movement at the far edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the mist that still clung to the ground. I adjusted my lens, zooming in on the area. What came into focus made my heart skip a beat. There, standing at the tree line, was a figure unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, and covered in what appeared to be dark, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear or any other animal I could identify. It stood upright on 2 legs, its posture unmistakably humanoid. My finger instinctively pressed the shutter button, capturing a rapid series of images as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. The creature's head turned, seeming to look directly at me, and I felt a jolt of primal fear course through my body. Its face was a bizarre mix of ape-like and human features, with deep-set eyes that held an unmistakable intelligence. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. I stared at the creature through my lens, and it stared back at me. There was a sense of mutual curiosity, an acknowledgement of 2 sentient beings encountering something outside their normal realm of experience. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and moved back into the forest. Its gait was smooth and surprisingly quick, covering ground with long, loping strides. Within seconds, it had vanished into the dense undergrowth, leaving me questioning if I had really seen what I thought I had. My hands were shaking as I lowered my camera. I took several deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. Part of me wanted to chase after the creature, to try and get another glimpse or perhaps find some physical evidence of its passage, but a stronger instinct told me to stay put, that pursuing something so unknown and potentially dangerous would be foolish. Instead, I turned my attention to my camera, frantically scrolling through the images I had just captured. There it was, a series of slightly blurry but unmistakable photos of a creature that shouldn't exist. In some shots, it was partially obscured by mist and foliage, but others showed it in clearer detail: the muscular, fur-covered body, the long arms ending in what looked like human-like hands, the face that seemed to be a missing link between ape and man. I sat there for a long time, staring at those images, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Could it be a hoax? Some elaborate costume worn by a prankster? But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The movement, the presence, the look in its eyes. This was a living, breathing creature. As the day wore on, I remained at my spot, half hoping the creature would return, half dreading the possibility. But the forest remained quiet, the only movement coming from the occasional gust of wind through the trees. As dusk approached, I finally packed up my gear and made my way back to my campsite. That night, every sound from the surrounding forest made me jump. I lay awake for hours, replaying the encounter in my mind, wondering what to do with the images I had captured. The next morning, I broke camp earlier than planned and hiked back to civilization. The entire way, I felt as if I was being watched, though I never saw any sign of the creature again. Back in the comfort of my home office, I spent days poring over the photos, enhancing them, analyzing every detail. The more I looked, the more convinced I became that what I had encountered was real, but I was also acutely aware of the implications of releasing such images to the public. I'm well respected in my field, known for my integrity and the authenticity of my work. Releasing photos of what many would dismiss as Bigfoot could potentially ruin my reputation. And yet, I felt a responsibility to share what I had seen, to contribute to our understanding of the natural world, no matter how paradigm-shifting it might be. In the end, I decided to reach out to a few trusted colleagues in the fields of biology and anthropology. Their reactions ranged from skepticism to cautious excitement. One suggested I submit the images for analysis to a lab specializing in wildlife identification. Another warned me about the potential backlash and ridicule I might face if I went public. Months have passed since that day in the Olympic National Forest, and I still haven't decided what to do with the images. They sit on an encrypted hard drive, a secret that weighs on me daily. I've returned to the area several times, hoping for another encounter, but the creature remains elusive. The experience has changed me profoundly. Every time I look through my camera lens now, I'm acutely aware that there might be things out there beyond our current understanding. It's humbling and exhilarating at the same time. I often find myself staring at the tree line when I'm out in nature, wondering if I'm being watched by eyes that belong to a creature science has yet to classify. The encounter has reignited a childlike sense of wonder about the world, a reminder that there are still mysteries out there waiting to be discovered. As for the creature itself, I can't help but wonder about its existence. How many of them are there? How have they remained hidden for so long? And most intriguingly, what would happen if their existence was definitively proven? For now, I keep the images to myself, a personal reminder that the world is far more wondrous and mysterious than we often allow ourselves to believe. And every time I head into the wilderness with my camera, I do so with a renewed sense of anticipation, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I'll have another encounter with the unknown. Because now I know without a doubt that there are things in this world that defy explanation, and as a photographer, as a seeker of truth, I can't help but want to capture them, to bring them into the light, even if the world might not be ready to see them. Story 7. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, aliens, cryptids, I chalked it all up to overactive imaginations and the human desire to believe in something extraordinary. But after that night in the Cascade Mountains, I'm not so sure anymore. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some sounds once heard will haunt you forever. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, just me, my tent, and the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. I'd chosen a remote spot, miles from the nearest marked campground. The area was known for its Sasquatch sightings, which I found amusing. I even packed a couple of beers to toast to the legendary creature, never imagining I'd end up face to face with something I couldn't explain. The hike-in was grueling but satisfying. By late afternoon, I'd set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and the distant sound of a mountain stream. As I sat by my small fire, watching the sun dip below the tree line, I felt a deep sense of peace. This was why I came out here, to disconnect, to remind myself of the raw beauty of nature. If only I'd known what was watching me from the shadows. The first sign that something was off came just after midnight. I'd been asleep for a couple of hours when a sound jolted me awake. It was a deep, rumbling vocalization, unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite a growl, not quite a roar. It seemed to vibrate through the ground and into my bones. I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding. It had to be a bear, I told myself. Just a large black bear, nothing to worry about as long as I stayed in my tent and didn't provoke it. But then I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, bipedal footsteps. They were slow at first, circling the perimeter of my campsite. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a bear. I reached for my flashlight with trembling hands, debating whether to turn it on. Part of me didn't want to see what was out there. But as the footsteps grew closer, my curiosity overpowered my fear. I flicked on the light, pointing it at the wall of my tent. And there, projected like some nightmarish shadow puppet show, was a silhouette that turned my blood to ice. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, with a distinctly ape-like shape. But the proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, shoulders impossibly broad. For a moment, it just stood there, its shadow looming over my tent. Then it moved, circling closer. I could hear its breathing now, deep, raspy inhalations that spoke of something far larger than any known animal in these woods. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as it completed its circuit of my tent. Logic warred with instinct in my mind. This couldn't be real. There had to be a rational explanation. But every sense I possessed was screaming that I was in the presence of something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. Just when I thought it might move on, the footsteps stopped right outside my tent door. I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest sound might provoke it. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence, Then slowly, deliberately it sniffed, long, deep inhalations that made the walls of my tent shudder. It was smelling me, I realized with growing horror, cataloguing my scent. What happened next will stay with me until the day I die. A hand, if you could call it that, pressed against the side of my tent. The fingers were huge, tipped with claws that I could hear scraping against the fabric. It wasn't a curious touch. It was a test. This thing was gauging the strength of the only barrier between us. In that moment, my tent felt as insubstantial as tissue paper. I was acutely aware of how vulnerable I was, how far from help. If this creature decided to tear its way in, there was nothing I could do to stop it. But it didn't. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the hand withdrew. The footsteps resumed, moving away from my tent and into the surrounding forest. Even when I could no longer hear them, I didn't dare move. I lay there, every muscle tensed, listening to the night. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. Whatever had visited my camp in the night was gone, for now, but I knew I couldn't stay. With shaking hands, I packed up my gear as quickly and quietly as I could. It wasn't until I was nearly back to my car that I allowed myself to really process what had happened. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. A bear walking on its hind legs, a vivid dream brought on by too many campfire stories. But I knew the truth. What I'd encountered was something else entirely, something that defied easy categorization. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into research. I read every book I could find on Bigfoot and Sasquatch legends. I pored over first-hand accounts of encounters, noting the similarities to my own experience. The size, the smell, the vocalizations, it all matched up. But it was the differences that truly chilled me. Most encounters were fleeting, a glimpse through the trees, a shadowy figure at a distance. What I'd experienced felt more deliberate. It hadn't just stumbled upon my camp. It had studied me, tested me. I found myself jumping at shadows, startling at every unexpected sound. Sleep became elusive, my dreams haunted by that massive silhouette and the memory of those probing fingers against my tent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd had a close encounter with something ancient and unknowable, something that had chosen to let me go. Months passed before I worked up the courage to go camping again. When I did, I chose a popular, well-trafficked campground. But even surrounded by other tents and the comforting sounds of families enjoying the outdoors, I couldn't relax. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. As time went on, the intensity of the memory faded, but the impact never did. I found myself looking at the world differently, more aware of the shadows at the edges of things. The certainty I'd once had about the natural world was gone, replaced by a profound sense of humility. There are times, especially on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, that I find myself thinking about that creature. Was it unique, or are there others like it out there? How long have they existed alongside us, hidden in the wild places of the world? And why, when it had me at its mercy, did it choose to leave me unharmed? I've never shared the full story until now. Who would believe me? Even as I write this, part of me wonders if I'm somehow misremembering, if fear and darkness played tricks on my mind. But then I remember the weight of that gaze, the undeniable presence I felt, and I know it was real. Sometimes I'm tempted to go back to that spot in the Cascades, to set up camp and wait, half hoping and half dreading another encounter. But something always holds me back. Maybe it's fear, or maybe it's the understanding that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Those dark forests hold secrets, ancient and wild. We like to think we've mapped every inch of this world, that we understand all its wonders and terrors. But my experience taught me otherwise. There are things out there, just beyond the reach of our campfires and the beam of our flashlights. Things that remind us that we're not as far removed from the primal world as we'd like to believe. And sometimes, if the conditions are just right, we might catch a glimpse of them. So the next time you're zipping up your tent for the night, listening to the sounds of the forest around you, remember my story. That breathing you hear might not be the wind. Those footsteps might not belong to a fellow camper, and that shadow outside your tent, well, it might be something far older and stranger than you ever imagined. Just hope it decides to let you go, too. Story 8. I've been a hunter all my life, but that night in the Appalachian wilderness turned me into the prey. It was supposed to be a routine hunting trip, a chance to bag a nice buck and enjoy the solitude of the mountains. Instead, it became a fight for survival against something I still can't explain. My name's Steve, and I've been hunting these woods since I was old enough to hold a rifle. I know every trail, every ridge, and every hollow like the back of my hand. Or at least I thought I did. But that trip showed me that even the most familiar places can hide terrifying secrets. It was late November, the heart of deer season. I'd taken a week off work to set up camp in a remote part of the national forest, miles from the nearest road or campsite. The area was known for its big bucks, and I was determined to bring one home. The first couple of days were uneventful. I saw plenty of does and a few smaller bucks, but I was holding out for something bigger. On the third day, I decided to push deeper into the backcountry, following an old game trail I'd never fully explored before. The day was cold and overcast, with a biting wind that cut through my layers. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached a small clearing nestled between two steep ridges. It was a perfect spot for deer to bed down, protected from the wind and with good sightlines in all directions. I found a good vantage point and settled in to wait, my rifle across my lap. As the hours ticked by, the clouds grew darker and the wind picked up. I was just about to call it a day when I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. My heart rate picked up as I raised my rifle, peering through the scope. But what I saw wasn't a deer. It was the carcass of one, or what was left of it. The body had been torn apart, its ribcage splayed open, and most of the meat stripped away. This wasn't the work of normal predators. I'd seen plenty of kills by bears and mountain lions, but this was different. The way the carcass was mutilated seemed almost deliberate. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Something wasn't right here. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get back to the safety of my camp. But curiosity got the better of me. I had to get a closer look. Keeping my rifle ready, I approached the carcass cautiously. The smell of blood and decay was overwhelming. As I got closer, I noticed strange marks in the dirt around the body. They looked almost like footprints, but they were huge and oddly shaped, unlike anything I'd seen before. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the woods behind me. I whirled around, my rifle at the ready, but saw nothing but shadows among the trees. The light was fading fast, and an unnatural silence had fallen over the forest. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear or a cougar, it was something else, something that sent a primal fear coursing through my veins. I didn't think twice. I ran. Crashing through the underbrush, I abandoned all pretense of stealth. Behind me I could hear something large moving through the forest, branches snapping under its weight. Whatever it was fast, much faster than me. I've never run so hard in my life. My lungs were burning, and branches whipped at my face as I tore through the darkening woods. I had no idea if I was even heading in the right direction. All I knew was that I had to get away from whatever was chasing me. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I broke through the trees and found myself at the base of a steep, rocky slope. Without hesitation, I started to climb. The rocks were slick with moss and loose in places, but fear gave me strength and agility I didn't know I possessed. About halfway up, I found a small ledge partially hidden by an overhanging rock. I wedged myself into the space, trying to control my ragged breathing. From my vantage point, I could see down into the forest below. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I saw it. A massive shape moved at the edge of the trees. In the fading light, I couldn't make out details, but what I could see defied explanation. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, and walked on 2 legs. But it wasn't human. Its proportions were all wrong, with long arms that nearly reached the ground and a hunched, powerful build. The creature paused at the base of the slope, and I could have sworn it was sniffing the air. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. Then, to my horror, it began to climb. I pressed myself further back into my hiding spot, my hand clenched so tightly around my rifle that my knuckles were white. I knew that if the creature found me, the gun would be useless. This thing could tear me apart before I got off a single shot. The sound of sliding rocks and heavy breathing grew closer. I closed my eyes, silently praying to whatever might be listening. The noises stopped, and I could sense a presence nearby. The smell hit me then, a pungent, musky odor that made my eyes water. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, the sounds began to recede. The creature was moving away, back down the slope. I waited until I could no longer hear it before I dared to open my eyes. The forest below was dark now, the details lost in the gloom, but I could still make out movement among the trees, the shape of something large making its way back into the depths of the woods. I stayed on that ledge all night, too terrified to move. Every sound, every shift of the wind convinced me that the creature was coming back. As the first light of dawn began to break, I finally gathered the courage to leave my hiding spot. The climb down was treacherous, my limbs stiff and shaky from cold and fear. When I reached the bottom, I saw the tracks again, those huge, inhuman footprints pressed deep into the soft earth. They led off into the forest, back in the direction of my camp. I didn't follow them. Instead, I started walking in the opposite direction, towards where I thought the nearest road might be. I walked all day, jumping at every sound, my rifle clutched tightly to my chest. It was nearly dark again when I finally stumbled onto a logging road. A passing trucker found me there, exhausted and babbling about monsters in the woods. He thought I was delirious from hypothermia and drove me straight to the nearest hospital. I never went back for my camping gear. I told the authorities that I'd gotten lost and disoriented, leaving out any mention of what I'd seen. Who would believe me anyway? In the weeks and months that followed, I pored over books and websites about cryptids and unexplained phenomena. I found stories of similar encounters, tales of giant ape-like creatures in the wilderness. Some called it Bigfoot, others Sasquatch. But none of the descriptions quite matched what I had seen. I haven't been hunting since that day. The thought of going back into those remote woods fills me with a dread I can't shake. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out the window, wondering what's really out there in the darkness. I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. It was real as the scars left by the branches on my face as I ran for my life. But I also know that if I told the full story, most people would think I was crazy or lying. So I keep it to myself, this secret knowledge that the wilderness holds mysteries far deeper and more terrifying than most people could imagine. And every time I see a news story about a hiker gone missing or strange sounds in the forest, I wonder if they too have encountered the thing that hunted me. Because I know it's still out there, somewhere in those ancient woods. Waiting, watching, and I can't help but wonder who will be its next prey. Story 9. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but the images I captured that day in the wilderness told a story I'm still struggling to understand. As a wildlife photographer, I've spent countless hours in the most remote corners of the world, patiently waiting for the perfect shot. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, capturing the vibrant autumn colors and diverse wildlife of the region for a nature magazine. I'd been trekking through the wilderness for days, my camera bag heavy with equipment, my mind focused on framing the perfect shot. The forest was a photographer's dream, with mist-shrouded valleys and towering evergreens creating an almost mystical atmosphere. On the third day of my expedition, I stumbled upon a secluded clearing that took my breath away. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on a carpet of fallen leaves. It was the kind of scene I lived for, and I quickly set up my tripod, eager to capture the magical interplay of light and shadow. As I peered through my viewfinder, making minute adjustments to my composition, something caught my eye at the edge of the frame. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow playing across the trees. But as I zoomed in, my heart began to race. There, partially obscured by the dense foliage, was a figure unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was tall, impossibly tall, and covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. For a moment I forgot to breathe. My finger hovered over the shutter release, trembling slightly. Click. The sound of the camera seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet clearing. I quickly checked the image on my display, half expecting to see nothing but trees and shadows. But there it was, a blurry but unmistakable shape that defied explanation. Excitement and fear warred within me as I raised my camera again. Whatever this thing was, I needed to document it. As a photographer, it was instinct. As a human being confronted with something impossible, it was a lifeline to reality. Click, click, click. I took shot after shot, my hands steadying as I fell into the familiar rhythm of my work. With each image, the figure seemed to move closer, becoming clearer in my viewfinder. It moved with an eerie grace that belied its size, gliding between the trees with silent precision. It wasn't until I lowered my camera to change lenses that the full impact of what I was seeing hit me. There, not 50 yards away, stood a creature that shouldn't exist. It was easily 8 feet tall, with a massive barrel-chested frame covered in thick, dark hair. Its face was an unsettling blend of ape-like features and something almost human, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with intelligence. Our gazes met, and in that moment, time seemed to stand still. Those eyes held something ancient and unknowable, a wisdom that spoke of centuries spent in the hidden corners of the world. I felt small, insignificant, like a child confronted with the vastness of the universe. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. With a fluidity that defied its bulk, the creature melted back into the forest, leaving nothing but a rustling of leaves in its wake. For several long moments, I stood rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what I'd just witnessed. Part of me wanted to follow, to chase this impossibility deeper into the woods, but a primal sense of self-preservation kept me frozen in place. With shaking hands, I retrieved my camera and began scrolling through the images I'd captured. Each one showed the creature a little closer, a little clearer. The final shot, taken just before our eyes met, was startlingly clear. There was no denying what I was looking at. This was no man in a suit, no clever hoax. This was something else entirely. As the initial shock began to wear off, my journalistic instincts kicked in. I had to document everything, to create a record of this encounter that went beyond just the photographs. I pulled out my notebook and began scribbling furiously, describing every detail I could remember. The way it moved, the texture of its fur, the depth of intelligence in its eyes. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on my original assignment, my mind constantly replaying the encounter. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me whirl around, half expecting to see that massive figure emerging from the trees. As night fell, I made camp, but sleep eluded me. I kept my camera close, checking and rechecking the images, terrified that they might somehow disappear, taking with them the proof of what I'd seen. The journey back to civilization was fraught with indecision. What should I do with these photographs? The journalist in me knew this could be the story of a lifetime. Concrete evidence of a creature that had been relegated to the realm of myth and legend. It would turn the scientific world on its head. But as I hiked through the quiet forest, another thought began to take hold. If this creature was real, and I knew in my bones that it was, then it had managed to remain hidden for centuries. It had chosen to reveal itself to me, had looked into my eyes with an intelligence that spoke of self-awareness. Did I have the right to expose its existence to the world? By the time I reached my car, I had made my decision. The photographs would remain private, at least for now. I couldn't bring myself to be the one who shattered the mystery, who exposed this incredible being to the harsh light of public scrutiny. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into research, reading every book and article I could find on Bigfoot and Sasquatch legends. The similarities to my own encounter were striking, the size, the way it moved, the sense of ancient wisdom. But none of the grainy photos or shaky videos came close to capturing what I had seen. I found myself returning to the forest whenever I could, drawn by a mix of hope and trepidation. I'd spend hours in that clearing, camera at the ready, waiting for another glimpse. But the creature never reappeared. Sometimes, though, I'd feel a prickle on the back of my neck, a sense of being watched that would send my heart racing. In those moments, I was certain it was out there, observing me from the shadows. The encounter changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. My photography took on a new dimension. I found myself drawn to the hidden spaces, the shadows between trees, always searching for a glimpse of something just beyond the ordinary. My editors noticed the shift, praising the new depth and mystery in my work, never knowing the true source of my inspiration. There are nights when I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that encounter in my mind. I think about those eyes, so full of intelligence and something that looked almost like recognition. Had it known me somehow? Had it chosen to reveal itself for a reason? The questions haunt me, driving me back to the wilderness again and again. Each time I set up my camera in a remote location, there's a part of me that hopes to capture that impossible figure once more. But there's another part, growing stronger with each passing day, that hopes it remains hidden, safe from the prying eyes of a world that might not understand. I've come to realize that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some wonders best left undiscovered. The creature I encountered represents something profound, a reminder that our world is vaster and more mysterious than we can imagine, that there are still secrets lurking in the wild places. So I keep the photographs locked away, a personal reminder of the day my understanding of the world changed forever. And when I'm out in the wilderness, camera in hand, I approach each shot with a newfound reverence. Because now I know that beyond the frame, just out of sight, there might be something watching back, something ancient, something wise, something that reminds us that we are not alone in this world, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, it might just let us catch a glimpse. Story 10. You never think it's going to happen to you. You hear stories, sure, wild stories of strange things lurking in the woods, whispered among rangers on their lunch breaks or shared around a campfire late at night. You shrug them off, laugh even, because you know the woods. You've been out there 1,000 times in the day, in the dead of night, and nothing ever really happens. Not to you. But that night was different. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the sky hangs low and heavy, pressing down with the weight of the coming night. I'd volunteered for the patrol, one of those late shifts most guys tried to avoid, but I didn't mind. It was my first year as a ranger, and I was still eager, still green enough to jump at any opportunity to prove myself. Plus, a part of me liked the solitude of the forest at night. It was peaceful, usually. I drove up to the northern sector, the part of the park that barely saw any traffic. Miles of dense woods, crisscrossed with old trails no one really used anymore. There had been reports of activity out there. Some hikers claimed they'd heard something strange. Screams, heavy footsteps, branches snapping in ways they shouldn't. The kind of vague, spooky stuff you hear all the time in a job like this. 9 times out of 10, it's a cougar, or maybe a bear, or just someone's imagination running wild in the dark. Still, I was curious. It was my job, after all, and I'd be lying if I said a small part of me didn't want to find something. Prove myself. I wasn't a rookie, not exactly, but I still felt the need to show I wasn't just some city kid who couldn't handle the woods. I pulled the truck into the gravel parking area at the head of the trail. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving only a faint orange glow behind the mountains. The air had that crisp, biting edge to it, the kind that settles into your bones and makes everything feel a little too quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, double-checking my gear before heading out. The trail stretched in front of me, dark and winding, disappearing into the trees like a black ribbon. As I walked, the sounds of the forest shifted. At first, it was the usual. Crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, the far-off hoot of an owl. Normal stuff. But the further I got, the quieter it became. The crickets stopped. The air seemed to thicken, and my footsteps on the gravel trail felt too loud, like I was breaking some unspoken rule of the woods. I tried to shake off the growing unease in my gut. This was my job, after all. I had a radio, a flashlight, and a knife. Whatever was out here, I could handle it. I was trained for this. But as the darkness closed in, that confidence started to slip. About an hour into the patrol, I came across a small clearing. The moon was rising now, casting an eerie pale light over the trees. My flashlight beam swept across the area, catching the edges of a small, run-down cabin I hadn't noticed before. It looked old, abandoned. The roof sagged, and the windows were dark holes, like empty eyes staring back at me. I felt a chill run up my spine. I shouldn't have been surprised. There were a few of these cabins scattered throughout the park, remnants of old logging operations or hunters' shelters. But this one, something about it didn't feel right. The air around it was still, too still, and I could have sworn I heard the faintest creak from inside. I radioed HQ. "This is Jake, checking in. Came across an old cabin on the northern trail. Nothing unusual yet, just making my rounds." The radio crackled, then silence. I waited, but there was no response. "HQ, do you copy?" More static. I cursed under my breath. The signal was spotty out here, always had been, but it still sent a cold stab of unease through me. I decided to check out the cabin. Maybe there was something inside, maybe just animals, but I needed to make sure. I couldn't leave it without investigating. That's what I told myself anyway. I stepped closer, the gravel crunching under my boots. The door was slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges that looked like they hadn't moved in years. I reached for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark interior. The cabin was small, just one room. Dust covered everything. Old wooden furniture, a table pushed against the far wall, a couple of broken chairs. Nothing unusual, except for the smell. It hit me as soon as I stepped inside, a rank, metallic scent like blood. My gut tightened. I scanned the room again, moving the flashlight slowly. My beam caught something dark splattered across the floor, smeared across the rotting wood in long streaks. My stomach twisted as I realized what it was. Blood, and it wasn't old. I backed up, heart pounding. What the hell? I hadn't heard anything about anyone getting hurt out here. No reports of missing hikers, no calls for help. This didn't make sense. I was about to leave when I heard it. Something moving in the woods. It was faint at first, just the soft rustle of leaves, but then it grew louder. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart jumped into my throat. I switched off the flashlight, dropping to a crouch near the door. My eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight filtering in through the cracks in the cabin's walls. The footsteps stopped just outside. Silence. My pulse thundered in my ears. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. Then, without warning, something slammed into the side of the cabin. The whole structure shook, dust raining down from the ceiling. I bit back a shout, every muscle in my body tensing. Another slam, this one harder. Whatever it was big, and it was trying to get in. I fumbled for my radio, keeping my voice low. "HQ, do you copy? I need backup, something's out here." The static cut out for a second, then a faint voice came through. "Ranger Jake, repeat, we—" A third slam cut off the transmission. The door creaked as the weight of whatever was outside pressed against it. I could hear it breathing now, a low, deep huff, like something massive sniffing the air. I don't know what came over me, but my survival instincts kicked in. I moved as silently as I could toward the back of the cabin, looking for another way out. There, near the far wall, was a small window, cracked and barely big enough for me to squeeze through. It was my only option. I could hear the thing outside circling again, its heavy footsteps crunching through the gravel. The cabin groaned under its weight. I forced myself to move, my heart hammering in my chest as I pushed open the window and crawled through. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I dropped to the ground, keeping low, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. The thing, it was close, too close. I could hear it moving, the sound of its breath, its massive frame brushing against the trees. I was trapped. The woods were dense, the trail was too far to run, and the cabin was no longer safe. I held my breath, crouching low in the brush, praying it wouldn't notice me. The footsteps stopped again. I could feel it. Whatever it was right behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I could feel the weight of its presence, the heat of its breath on the back of my neck. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it a bear? No. Bears don't act like this. They don't stalk, don't circle like they're playing with their prey. Slowly, I reached for the knife on my belt. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Then, the footsteps started again, moving away from me this time, deeper into the woods. I stayed frozen, muscles locked in place, listening as the sound grew fainter, then disappeared altogether. I waited another few minutes just to be sure before I dared to move. My legs were trembling as I slowly stood, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. The woods were silent again, but not in the peaceful way they had been before. This silence was thick with tension, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I made my way back to the trail as quickly and quietly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting those footsteps to return. But the creature, whatever it was, had vanished into the night. By the time I reached the truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. I floored it, not stopping until I was back at the ranger station, my heart still racing, my mind spinning. When I finally got back inside, I tried the radio again. HQ's voice crackled through the speaker. "Ranger Jake, where the hell have you been? We lost your signal for over an hour." I didn't answer right away. My mouth was dry and my mind was still trying to process what I'd just experienced. I don't know, I finally whispered, staring out into the darkness beyond the station. "But there's something out there. Something big." I never went back to that part of the woods again. Story 11. I've explored caves all my life, but nothing could have prepared me for what lurked in the depths of Shadow Cavern. What began as an exciting new discovery quickly turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. Some things, I've learned, are better left buried in the dark. My name is Dave, and I'm a seasoned spelunker with over 2 decades of experience. I've navigated some of the most challenging cave systems in the world, from the vast networks of Mammoth Cave to the underwater caverns of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. But it was a small, unassuming opening in the Ozark Mountains that would change my life forever. It was a crisp autumn day when my team and I set out to explore a newly discovered cave system. Local hikers had stumbled upon the entrance a few weeks earlier, and initial surveys suggested it could be extensive. As the lead explorer, I was eager to be the first to map its depths. Our team of 4 arrived at the cave entrance early in the morning. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but our equipment indicated a large chamber beyond. As we prepared our gear, I felt the familiar mix of excitement and apprehension that always preceded a new exploration. "Remember," I told the team, "we stick together. No wandering off, no matter how tempting a side passage looks. We map as we go, and we turn back at the first sign of danger. Clear?" They nodded, their faces a mixture of determination and nervous anticipation. With a final check of our equipment, we switched on our headlamps and entered the cave. The initial passage was tight and winding, forcing us to crawl on our stomachs for the first 100 feet. The rough limestone scraped against our coveralls as we inched forward. Just as claustrophobia began to set in, the passage widened and we found ourselves in a vast chamber. Our headlamps barely penetrated the darkness, the beams swallowed by the immensity of the space. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like giant stone icicles, some reaching down to meet stalagmites rising from the floor. The air was cool and damp, with a musty odor that hinted at the cave's ancient origins. As we began to survey the chamber, I noticed something odd. The walls were covered in strange markings, unlike any cave formations I'd seen before. They looked almost like claw marks, but larger and more deliberate than anything a bear or mountain lion could make. I ran my hand over the grooves, feeling their depth and precision. "Hey guys," I called out, "come take a look at this." The team gathered around, their headlamps illuminating the wall. "What do you think made these?" Sarah, our geologist, asked, her voice tinged with confusion. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "But they're all over the place. Let's photograph them for later analysis." As we moved deeper into the cave system, the markings became more frequent and more elaborate. Some seemed to form patterns, almost like a primitive form of writing. It was unlike anything I'd encountered in my years of caving, and a sense of unease began to creep over me. We had been exploring for several hours when we came across a narrow fissure in the cave wall. Cool air flowed from the opening, suggesting a larger space beyond. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but my curiosity got the better of me. "I'm going to check it out," I told the team. "Sarah, you're with me. Mike and John, stay here and keep mapping this section. If we're not back in 30 minutes, come looking for us." Sarah and I squeezed through the fissure, emerging into a tunnel that sloped steeply downward. The air grew colder as we descended, and the strange markings on the walls became more frequent and frenzied. After about 10 minutes of careful climbing, we entered another chamber, smaller than the first, but with a high, domed ceiling. Our headlamps revealed something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the chamber was a pile of bones, some clearly animal, others disturbingly human-like in appearance. "Dave," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking, "what is this place?" Before I could answer, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the chamber. It wasn't the sound of shifting rocks or running water. It was something alive, and it was close. Our headlamps darted around the chamber, searching for the source of the sound. In the far corner, partially hidden by a cluster of stalagmites, I saw a dark opening. 2 gleaming eyes reflected our light, and I caught a glimpse of something large moving in the shadows. "Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "we need to leave. Now." We backed towards the tunnel we had come through, our eyes fixed on the dark opening. The growling grew louder, and I saw something begin to emerge from the shadows. It was large, far larger than any cave-dwelling creature I knew of, with a body covered in what looked like coarse, matted fur. As it moved into the light, I saw that it walked on two legs, its posture unnaturally hunched. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape-like features and something almost human, with deep-set eyes that held an unsettling intelligence. We didn't wait to see more. We turned and ran, scrambling up the sloping tunnel as fast as we could. Behind us, I could hear the creature moving, its heavy footsteps echoing off the cave walls. We burst out of the fissure into the main chamber, startling Mike and John. "Run!" I yelled. "Everyone out now!" We didn't stop to explain, didn't pause to gather our equipment. We just ran, our headlamps bobbing wildly as we retraced our steps through the cave system. The sound of pursuit faded as we neared the entrance, but we didn't slow down. We squeezed through the narrow opening into the blessed daylight, gasping for air and shaking with adrenaline. As we caught our breath, I recounted what Sarah and I had seen to Mike and John. Their faces paled as I described the creature. "What do we do now?" John asked. I thought for a moment, my mind racing. "We seal the entrance," I decided. "Use the explosives from the survey kit. We can't risk that thing getting out." We worked quickly, setting charges around the cave opening. With a deafening boom, the entrance collapsed, sealing whatever was inside away from the world. As we hiked back to our vehicles, a heavy silence hung over the team. We all knew that what we had encountered defied explanation, and we silently agreed that no one would believe us if we told the truth. In the days and weeks that followed, I pored over our limited data and the few photos we had managed to take before our hasty exit. The claw marks, the bone pile, the glimpse of the creature. It all pointed to something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I've kept the true story of Shadow Cavern to myself all these years. The official report states that we found an unstable cave system and sealed it for safety reasons. But I know the truth, and it haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring at the photos, tracing the strange markings with my finger. I wonder about the creature we encountered. Was it the last of its kind, a relic from a prehistoric age, or are there more out there, hidden in the dark places of the world? I haven't gone caving since that day. The thought of entering those dark, enclosed spaces fills me with a dread I can't shake. But more than that, I'm afraid of what else we might find lurking in the depths of the earth. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. As I sit here writing this account, I can't help but wonder, did we do the right thing by sealing the cave? Or have we simply trapped something down there, something that will one day find another way out into our world? One thing I know for certain. The next time someone discovers a new cave system, I won't be the one to explore it. Because now I know that in the darkest corners of our world, in places untouched by sunlight for millions of years, things can evolve, can survive, that defy our understanding of nature itself. And some of those things, I fear, are waiting, watching, ready to emerge from the shadows and reclaim a world they once knew. Story 12. I've been a hunter all my life, but that night in the woods changed everything. It wasn't just the blood-curdling howl that echoed through the trees or the mutilated deer carcass I stumbled upon. It was the moment I realized I wasn't the predator anymore. I was the prey. The day had started like any other hunting trip. I'd woken before dawn, packed my gear, and headed out to my favorite spot, deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of a successful hunt. I'd been tracking a particularly large buck for weeks, and today I was determined to bring him down. As I made my way through the familiar trails, something felt off. The forest was too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an eerie silence that set my teeth on edge. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the changing seasons and my own anticipation. By mid-afternoon, I'd picked up the buck's trail. Fresh tracks and droppings told me he'd passed through recently. I moved carefully, every sense on high alert. The light was fading fast, filtering through the trees in long, golden shafts. I knew I didn't have much time left before I'd have to call it a day. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement up ahead. My heart raced as I raised my rifle, expecting to see the majestic antlers of my quarry, but what I found instead turned my blood to ice. There, in a small clearing, lay the mangled remains of a deer. Not my buck, but a younger doe. Her body was torn apart in a way I'd never seen before. This wasn't the work of a bear or a mountain lion. The precision of the cuts, the way the carcass was positioned, it was almost ritualistic. I approached cautiously, my rifle at the ready. The coppery smell of blood filled the air, mixed with something else, a musky animal odor that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As I knelt to examine the carcass, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I spun around, my finger on the trigger, but saw nothing but shadows between the trees. The sun had nearly set, casting long, dark shapes across the forest floor. I realized with a start that I'd left my flashlight back at camp, a rookie mistake I hadn't made in years. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a sound I recognized, not bear or wolf or any animal I'd encountered in my decades of hunting. This was something else entirely, something that spoke to a primal part of my brain and screamed danger. I backed away from the deer carcass, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The growl came again, closer this time. I raised my rifle, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the gathering darkness. "This is private property. Identify yourself." The only response was another growl, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps circling my position. Whatever this thing was, it was big, and it was hunting me. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare it off. The sound echoed through the trees, momentarily drowning out the creature's growls. For a second, I thought it had worked. Then I heard it, a howl that chilled me to my very core. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or a coyote. This was something ancient and terrible, a sound that didn't belong in this world. In that moment, I knew I was dealing with something beyond my understanding. I ran. All thoughts of hunting, of maintaining my position, evaporated in the face of pure animal terror. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. Behind me I could hear it pursuing, heavy footfalls and the sound of snapping branches. In my panic I lost all sense of direction. The familiar woods had become a maze of shadows and unseen obstacles. I tripped over a root, sprawling face first into the leaf litter. My rifle went flying, disappearing into the darkness. As I scrambled to my feet, I realized with horror that I'd dropped my only weapon. The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by that bone-chilling growl. I looked around desperately for something, anything I could use to defend myself. That's when I remembered. My hunting knife. I always kept it sheathed at my hip, more out of habit than necessity. With trembling hands, I drew the blade, its polished surface gleaming in the faint moonlight that filtered through the canopy. I backed up against a large oak tree, my knife held out in front of me. The growling had stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing. I could smell it now, that same musky odor I'd detected near the deer carcass, but stronger, overwhelming. "Come on then," I whispered, more to steady myself than anything else. "Let's see you." As if in response to my challenge, it stepped into a patch of moonlight. What I saw defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a body covered in thick matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of wolf and human features, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. But it was the hands that truly terrified me, not paws, but long-fingered appendages tipped with vicious claws. For a moment, we stared at each other, predator and prey locked in a primal standoff. I knew in that instant that my knife, my years of hunting experience, meant nothing. This creature was something out of legend, something that shouldn't exist. Just as I was certain it was about to lunge, to tear me apart as it had the deer, something changed. Its eyes, which had been blazing with hunger, seemed to soften. It cocked its head to one side, regarding me with what almost looked like curiosity. Then, with a grace that belied its size, it turned and loped back into the shadows, leaving me trembling against the tree. I don't know how long I stood there, knife clutched in my shaking hand, before I finally found the courage to move. The trek back to my campsite was a blur of constant vigilance and paralyzing fear. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. When I finally stumbled into the clearing where I'd set up camp, I half expected to find it destroyed, my gear scattered by the creature's massive hands. But everything was exactly as I'd left it. My flashlight sat on top of my backpack, a silent rebuke to my earlier carelessness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by my campfire, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, jumping at every sound. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I packed up my gear with trembling hands and headed back to civilization. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I pored over books on cryptozoology, on local legends of creatures that roamed the Appalachian wilderness. I found myself jumping at shadows, startling at every unexpected sound. I never reported what I saw. Who would believe me? I'd be labeled a drunk or a madman, but I knew what I'd encountered was real. It had looked into my eyes with an intelligence that was undeniably self-aware, and for reasons I still can't fathom, it had chosen to let me go. I've been back to those woods since that night. Some compulsion I can't explain draws me there, a mix of fear and fascination. I never bring my rifle anymore. Somehow it seems pointless in the face of what I now know exists in the world. Sometimes, when the moon is full and the shadows are long, I think I catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond the trees. A flash of fur, the glint of eyes in the darkness. And I wonder, is it watching me? Does it remember our encounter as vividly as I do? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Those dark forests hold secrets, ancient and wild. We like to think we're at the top of the food chain, that we've tamed the natural world. But my experience taught me otherwise. There are things out there, just beyond the reach of our campfires and the beam of our flashlights. Things that remind us that we're not as far removed from the primal world as we'd like to believe. And sometimes, if the conditions are just right, we might catch a glimpse of them. Just hope they decide to let you go too. Story 13. I've hiked thousands of miles across some of the most challenging terrains on Earth, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror I experienced on what should have been a routine day hike in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a journey that began with excitement and ended with a run for my life, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. My name is Mark, and I've been an avid hiker and outdoor enthusiast for most of my life. I've conquered trails from the rugged paths of Patagonia to the snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas. But it was on a familiar trail, one I'd hiked dozens of times before, where I encountered something that defied explanation and shook me to my core. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on the Whispering Pines Trail, a moderate 12-mile loop that winds through some of the most picturesque parts of the Appalachian wilderness. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the landscape in vibrant hues of red, orange, and gold. I'd chosen a weekday for my hike, hoping to enjoy the solitude of the trail without the weekend crowds. As I shouldered my pack and set off from the trailhead, I felt the familiar rush of excitement that always accompanies the start of a new adventure. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves and pine needles. Birds chirped in the canopy above, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. It was perfect hiking weather. The first few miles were uneventful. I maintained a steady pace, pausing occasionally to take in the breathtaking views or snap a photo of particularly stunning fall foliage. About 4 miles in, I reached a scenic overlook that provided a panoramic view of the valley below. As I stood there, catching my breath and sipping water, I noticed something odd. The forest below seemed to be moving, not in the way trees normally sway in the wind, but in a more deliberate manner. It was as if the shadows between the trees were shifting, coalescing and dispersing in a rhythm that felt almost purposeful. I blinked hard and looked again, but the strange movement had stopped. I chalked it up to a trick of the light and continued on my way, though a faint sense of unease had begun to creep over me. As I delved deeper into the forest, the trail began to feel different. The markers seemed further apart than I remembered, and the path itself appeared less worn. I consulted my map and GPS, reassuring myself that I was still on the right track. But as the hours passed, a nagging feeling grew that something wasn't right. The forest had grown quieter. The cheerful birdsong that had accompanied me earlier had faded away, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I quickened my pace, eager to complete the loop and return to the trailhead. It was then that I heard it, a sound that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard in these woods before. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. This sound was deeper, more primal, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. My heart racing, I scanned the forest around me. The shadows between the trees seemed darker now, more substantial, and they were moving again, shifting and swirling in a way that defied natural explanation. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, I saw something emerge from behind a large oak tree about 50 yards ahead. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was tall, much taller than a man, with a body that seemed to shimmer and shift, as if it wasn't fully solid. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, but distorted, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent in impossible ways. And its face, I'll never forget that face. It was featureless, like a blank mask, yet somehow I knew it was looking directly at me. In that moment, every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, and run I did. I turned and sprinted back the way I had come, my pack bouncing painfully against my back. Behind me, I could hear movement in the forest, the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling. Whatever that thing was, it was following me. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but terror drove me forward. The trail seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't remember, and more than once I found myself veering off the path, only to course-correct and keep running. As I ran, the forest around me seemed to come alive. Shadows darted between the trees, always just at the edge of my vision. The growling sound grew louder, joined by other noises, clicking, chittering sounds that made my skin crawl. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish chase. But eventually, mercifully, I burst out of the tree line and into the parking lot where I had started my hike. I stumbled to my car, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock the door. As I collapsed into the driver's seat, I finally allowed myself to look back at the forest. The trees stood silent and still, betraying no hint of the terror I had just experienced. But as I stared, I saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods, a tall, shadowy figure that seemed to melt back into the darkness. I started the car and peeled out of the parking lot, not slowing down until I was miles away on the main highway. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a hallucination brought on by dehydration or exhaustion? But I knew deep down that it had been real. The scratches on my arms from crashing through the underbrush and the lingering scent of something musty and ancient on my clothes were proof enough. In the days and weeks that followed, I pored over maps of the area, trying to understand how a 12-mile loop trail could have turned into such a prolonged ordeal. I researched local legends and folklore, looking for any mention of strange creatures in the forest. I found a few vague stories, whispered tales of hikers gone missing and eerie encounters in the woods, but nothing that fully explained what I had seen. I haven't been back to that trail since, and my once passionate love for hiking has been tainted by the memory of that day. I still venture out into nature, but never alone, and never without a deep sense of unease. Because now I know that in the depths of the forest, in the spaces between the trees where the shadows grow deep, there are things that defy explanation, things that watch and wait, perhaps for unwary hikers who stray too far from the beaten path. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out the window at the distant tree line, wondering if I'll ever fully understand what happened to me that day. And in those moments, I swear I can hear a faint, familiar growl carried on the wind, a reminder that some trails once taken can never truly be left behind. As I sit here recounting this story, I can't help but wonder about the other hikers who venture into those woods. How many have experienced something similar but were too afraid to speak up? How many have disappeared, swallowed by the forest and whatever lurks within it? I've debated whether to share my experience, knowing that most would dismiss it as the ramblings of a madman or an overactive imagination. But I feel compelled to warn others, to urge caution to those who might dismiss the old tales and venture unprepared into the wilderness. Because now I know that the line between the world we think we know and the realm of the unexplained is far thinner than we realize. And sometimes, on a lonely trail in the depths of the forest, that line can disappear altogether, leaving us face to face with terrors beyond our comprehension. So to those who love the outdoors, who find solace in the quiet of the forest and the challenge of the trail, I say this: enjoy the beauty of nature, but never forget that you are a visitor in an ancient and mysterious world, and always be prepared for the possibility that some trails may lead you places you never expected to go. Story 14. When you camp alone in the woods, the silence can be peaceful. It's the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts, lets you breathe in the world around you without distraction. But sometimes, the silence turns. It shifts, and instead of peaceful, it feels like you're being watched. That's when you know something's wrong. I had set up camp deep in the backcountry, far from the usual trails and crowds. Just me, my tent, and a small fire crackling in the clearing I'd found. The forest stretched out around me, endless, the trees standing tall like sentinels under the fading light of the sky. It was perfect. Exactly what I needed. I had come out here to get away from it all, clear my head, and recharge. No phones, no work, no noise, just nature. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. I finished setting up my tent, double-checked my gear, and stoked the fire a little higher. The air was crisp, the kind that makes you pull your jacket tighter around your shoulders. I sat by the fire, letting the warmth sink in, staring at the flames licking up into the darkening sky. I should have been completely relaxed, but something was gnawing at the back of my mind, something I couldn't shake. The forest felt too quiet, too still. I tried to brush it off. It wasn't my first time camping alone, not by a long shot. I'd spent countless nights in the wilderness, and I knew that sometimes the woods just stopped. The animals go quiet, the wind dies down. But tonight, it felt different. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was like the forest was holding its breath. It was when the first twig snapped that I sat up straight, my ears straining. It came from somewhere behind me, deeper in the trees. Not close, but not far either. It was the kind of sound that usually wouldn't even register, but out here, alone, it sent a chill crawling up my spine. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the unease growing in my chest. Or maybe a raccoon. I went back to tending the fire, poking at the embers, trying to focus on the warmth and the soft crackling of the flames. But my mind kept wandering back to that sound. It hadn't been a deer. Deer are quiet. Too quiet. Whatever made that noise was heavier. An hour passed, and the night settled in around me. The stars blinked through the canopy of trees, and the firelight cast flickering shadows across the forest floor. I tried to lose myself in the beauty of it, but the nagging sense of being watched wouldn't go away. Every so often, I'd hear another rustle, another snap of a branch in the distance, always just out of sight. By the time I decided to crawl into my tent for the night, the forest had fallen into an eerie kind of silence again. My fire was burning low, and the darkness had thickened, swallowing up the edges of the clearing. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, pulling it up tight around my chin, trying to ignore the unease settling deep in my gut. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. It couldn't have been more than an hour later when I woke up to the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. My breath caught in my throat, heart pounding so loud I thought whoever, whatever, was out there could hear it too. I lay perfectly still, my body frozen with fear, ears straining to catch every noise. The footsteps were slow, almost measured, like they were being careful not to make too much noise, but heavy enough to know they weren't some small animal. They stopped, then started again, closer this time, crunching leaves and snapping small twigs. I reached for my flashlight, hands trembling, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position, as if whoever was out there didn't already know exactly where I was. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It couldn't be another camper. No one else was out this far. No way. I hadn't seen a single soul all day. The footsteps continued to circle the tent, slow, deliberate. Then they stopped. Dead silence. I held my breath, straining to hear something, anything, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, of something just on the other side of the thin fabric of the tent. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight out there, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Not yet. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in place, but eventually the footsteps started up again, moving away this time, deeper into the woods. The air felt lighter, less oppressive, but my fear didn't go away. I listened until the sound of the footsteps faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. After what felt like an eternity, I finally dared to move. Slowly, quietly, I unzipped the tent, just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing. The forest was still, the trees standing tall and silent, but I could feel it. Whatever had been out there was still nearby, watching. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and stepped out of the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping over the clearing and into the trees. Nothing. But as I moved the light to the ground, my blood ran cold. There were tracks, large, deep prints in the dirt circling my tent. They were too big to be human, and they didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. The prints were elongated, almost like a canine's, but larger, much larger. I crouched down to get a closer look, my stomach twisting with fear. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Whoever had made them had been here recently, very recently. I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand, and scanned the edge of the clearing again. Still nothing. But I knew deep down that whatever had made those tracks was still out there, watching. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but the thought of trekking back through the forest in the dark with something stalking me was even worse than staying put. I didn't want to be caught out there, exposed, without the safety of my fire and my tent, so I stoked the fire back to life, adding more wood until the flames burned high and bright, casting long shadows into the trees. I sat there by the fire, gripping my flashlight and knife, listening to every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches. My nerves were shot, every sound sending a fresh wave of fear through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I just had to make it until morning. The sun would come up, and everything would make sense again. It always does, but as the hours dragged on, the forest never returned to its usual rhythm. No birds, no insects, nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional distant snap of a branch. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen and heard. Bears didn't walk like that, wolves didn't leave prints that large, and humans didn't move like that in the night. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I must have drifted off by the fire, the tension finally giving way to sleep. When I woke up, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees, casting soft golden rays over the clearing. The fire had burned down to glowing embers again, and the forest was starting to come alive with the sounds of birds and small animals moving through the underbrush. I stood, stretching my stiff muscles, and looked around. The fear that had gripped me all night seemed to fade with the rising sun, but the memory of those footsteps, those tracks, still lingered in the back of my mind. I walked over to the edge of the clearing, back to where I had seen the tracks the night before. They were still there, clear as day, circling my tent, leading off into the woods. My breath caught in my throat as I followed them with my eyes. They disappeared into the tree line, heading deeper into the forest, to a place I hadn't explored. I packed up my camp in record time, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my bag. I didn't want to stay here a second longer. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't something I wanted to meet in the daylight either. As I hiked back down the trail, the sun high in the sky now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The forest seemed lighter, warmer, but that sense of something lurking just beyond my sight stayed with me. I've been out in those woods countless times since that night, but I've never camped alone again. And sometimes, when I'm out there late, just before the sun sets, I still hear footsteps in the distance, slow and deliberate, following me, and I never stay to find out what they belong to. Story 15. I've always been drawn to the unknown, to the places where civilization fades and wilderness takes over. But there are some dark corners of this world that are better left unexplored. I learned that lesson the hard way, in a cave hidden deep in the Ozark Mountains. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, a chance to clear my head and escape the pressures of my job in the city. I'd done my research, packed my gear, and set out at dawn, eager to lose myself in the rugged beauty of the landscape. The trail was challenging but rewarding, winding through dense forests and along rocky ridgelines that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding valleys. By mid-afternoon, I'd covered more ground than I'd planned. The map showed a network of smaller, unmarked trails branching off from the main path, and on a whim I decided to explore one. It was narrower and less well-maintained, but something about it called to me. Maybe it was the promise of discovering something few others had seen, or maybe it was just my own restlessness pushing me further into the wild. The trail led me into a deep ravine, the walls rising steep and imposing on either side. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As I rounded a bend, I saw it, a dark opening in the rock face, partially hidden by a curtain of vines. A cave, unmarked on any of my maps. I hesitated at the entrance, peering into the gloom. Common sense told me to turn back, to stick to the marked trails and leave the cave unexplored. But curiosity won out. I clicked on my headlamp and stepped into the darkness. The cave opened up quickly, the ceiling soaring high above me. My light barely penetrated the shadows, creating an island of illumination in a sea of black. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and debris, but as I moved deeper, I noticed something odd. There were marks on the walls, not the random scratches you'd expect from natural erosion, but deliberate patterns. Some looked like claw marks, others like crude symbols etched into the stone. A shiver ran down my spine, but I pressed on. The air grew colder, and I could hear the faint sound of running water echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave. As I rounded a corner, my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. There, arranged in a crude circle, was a nest. But this was no ordinary animal den. It was massive, easily 10 feet across, made of broken branches and what looked disturbingly like animal bones. And in the center, partially hidden by the debris, was a human skull. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the nest. The skull was old, its surface stained and pitted with age. But it was unmistakably human. What kind of creature would build a nest like this? And why would it include human remains? As I leaned in for a closer look, my foot caught on something. I stumbled, my hand instinctively reaching out to catch myself on the cave wall. As my palm made contact with the rock, I felt something sticky and warm. I pulled my hand back, shining my light on it. It was covered in a dark, viscous substance that looked horribly like fresh blood. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very walls of the cave. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. The sound reverberated through the chamber, growing louder with each passing second. I turned to run, but in my panic I lost my footing on the uneven ground. I fell hard, my headlamp flying off and shattering against a rock. Darkness enveloped me, broken only by the faint glow of my watch face. The growling grew closer. I could hear something moving in the darkness, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. The smell hit me next, a powerful, musky odor that made my eyes water. It was the smell of predator, of something ancient and dangerous. I scrambled backwards, my hands scraping against the rough cave floor. My back hit the wall, and I realized with horror that I was trapped. The sounds were all around me now, breathing, sniffing, the scrape of claws on stone. In the dim light from my watch, I saw movement. A shape, massive and hunched, emerging from the shadows. It was easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of bear and human features, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. I was face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something out of legend and nightmare. In that moment, I understood why the cave wasn't on any maps, why there were no marked trails leading to this place. This was a secret kept by the mountains themselves, a predator that had existed alongside us for centuries, hidden in the dark places of the world. The creature moved closer, its breath hot on my face. I closed my eyes, certain that my life was about to end in this dark cave, far from any help. But then something unexpected happened. It sniffed me long and deep, its nose pressed against my neck. I held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Then slowly, it backed away. I opened my eyes to see it retreating into the darkness, its glowing eyes fixed on me until the last moment. For several long minutes, I didn't move. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the distant drip of water. When I finally found the courage to stand, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk. I don't remember much of my frantic climb out of the cave. I stumbled through the darkness, scraping my hands and knees on the rocky floor, driven by pure animal terror. When I finally burst out into the fading daylight, I fell to my knees, gulping in the fresh air. The hike back to my car was a blur of constant vigilance and paralyzing fear. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I half expected to see that monstrous shape emerge from the trees at any moment. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I pored over books on local legends, on cryptozoology, searching for any mention of cave-dwelling creatures in the Ozarks. I found fragments of stories, tales of wild men living in the mountains, of hikers gone missing, and strange howls echoing through the valleys at night. I never reported what I saw. Who would believe me? I'd be labeled a hysteric or a liar. But I knew what I'd encountered was real. It had looked into my eyes with an intelligence that was undeniably self-aware, and for reasons I still can't fathom, it had chosen to let me go. The encounter changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself drawn to the wilderness more than ever, but now there's an edge to my adventures, a heightened awareness of the shadows between the trees. I listen more closely to the sounds of the forest, always half expecting to hear that bone-chilling growl again. Sometimes, when I'm hiking in remote areas, I'll come across a cave entrance or a dark hollow in the rocks. And for a moment, I'll feel that same mix of fear and fascination that led me into the cave that day. But I never enter. Some mysteries I've learned are better left unexplored. I often wonder about the creature in the cave. Was it unique, or are there others like it out there? How long has it existed hidden from human eyes, and why did it spare me when it so clearly could have ended my life? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Those dark forests and deep caves hold secrets, ancient and wild. We like to think we've mapped every inch of this world, that we understand all its wonders and terrors. But my experience taught me otherwise. There are things out there, just beyond the reach of our flashlights and the edges of our maps. Things that remind us that we're not as far removed from the primal world as we'd like to believe. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just stumble upon them. So the next time you're out in the wild and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, remember my story. Look carefully at the shadows between the trees. Listen for sounds that don't quite fit. You might just catch a glimpse of something that will change your view of the world forever. Just be prepared to run. Story 16. I've spent countless nights camping by lakes, but nothing could have prepared me for what I witnessed that moonlit evening on the shores of Lake Whisper. What began as a peaceful solo camping trip turned into a night of terror that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name is Brian, and I've been an avid outdoorsman for as long as I can remember. Camping, fishing, hiking, you name it, I've done it. But my favorite pastime has always been finding secluded spots by remote lakes, where I can spend a few days alone with nature, away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. It was late August when I decided to take a trip to Lake Whisper, a small, lesser-known body of water nestled deep in the forests of northern Minnesota. I'd heard rumors about its excellent fishing and pristine shoreline, untouched by the usual crowd of summer vacationers. It sounded perfect for a solo camping trip. I arrived at the lake late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping low on the horizon. The lake lived up to its name. The surface was like glass, reflecting the surrounding pines and the deepening blue of the sky. I found a perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing about 20 yards from the shoreline with a clear view of the water. As I set up my tent and gathered wood for a fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often I'd pause and scan the tree line, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the wind in the pines and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake. I chalked it up to the usual paranoia that comes with being alone in the wilderness and focused on getting my camp in order. By the time night fell, I had a cozy fire going and was settling in with a cup of hot coffee, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the lake. It was the kind of night that reminds you why you fell in love with the outdoors in the first place. I must have dozed off at some point, lulled to sleep by the crackling fire and the gentle lapping of waves on the shore. I'm not sure how long I was out, but I was jolted awake by a sound that seemed entirely out of place, a loud splash, followed by what I can only describe as a deep, guttural growl. Fully alert now, I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the lake. The beam caught something moving in the water about 50 yards offshore. At first, I thought it might be a deer swimming across the lake. I'd seen that before on other camping trips, but as I watched, I realized this was something much larger. The creature, whatever it was moving with powerful strokes, leaving a wake that seemed too big for any normal wildlife I was familiar with. As it got closer to shore, I could make out more details, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but much larger, easily 7 or 8 feet tall as it emerged from the water. Its body was covered in what looked like dark, matted fur, sleek from the water, but it was the face that truly terrified me. In the moonlight, I could see that it had a snout-like muzzle, more like a wolf than anything human. Its eyes caught the light of my flashlight, reflecting back with an eerie yellowish glow. I was frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The creature stood at the water's edge for a moment, water streaming from its massive form. Then it turned its head and looked directly at me. In that moment, I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. This wasn't just an animal. There was an intelligence in those eyes, an awareness that seemed impossible. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, without warning, the creature let out a roar that shook me to my core. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, part animal, part something else entirely, and it galvanized me into action. I scrambled to my feet, nearly falling over in my haste. I could hear heavy footsteps coming up from the shore, the sound of branches snapping under enormous weight. Without thinking, I dove into my tent, zipping it up as if that flimsy barrier could offer any protection. Inside the tent, I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands. No signal, of course. I was miles from the nearest cell tower. I debated making a run for my car, but it was parked a good quarter-mile away, and the idea of trying to navigate the dark forest with that thing out there was terrifying. So I huddled in my tent, straining my ears for any sound of the creature. For a while, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then, from unsettlingly close by, came the sound of sniffing, loud, deliberate inhalations that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was right outside my tent. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. The sniffing continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, to my horror, I felt something press against the side of the tent, something large and solid. I bit back a scream, certain that at any moment the creature would tear through the thin fabric. But it didn't. After a few heart-stopping moments, I heard it move away, its heavy footsteps receding towards the lake. I didn't dare move or make a sound until I heard another splash, the sound of something large entering the water. Slowly, cautiously, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. In the moonlight, I could see ripples spreading across the surface of the lake, and in the distance, the dark shape of the creature swimming away. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my tent, clutching my flashlight and a can of bear spray, jumping at every sound. As the first light of dawn began to break, I finally worked up the courage to emerge from my tent. The campsite looked normal in the early morning light, but as I walked down to the shore, I saw evidence that the night's events hadn't been a dream or hallucination. There, in the soft mud at the water's edge, were footprints. Massive, clearly defined prints that looked like a bizarre mix of human and animal. They were easily twice the size of my own feet, with clear claw marks at the end of each toe. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands still shaking. Then I packed up my camp in record time and practically ran to my car. As I drove away from Lake Whisper, my mind raced with questions. What had I seen? Was it some unknown species, a creature that had somehow remained hidden from science? Or was it something else entirely, something that defied rational explanation? In the weeks that followed, I pored over books and websites, searching for any information that might explain what I had encountered. I found plenty of legends and folklore about creatures in lakes, everything from Native American myths to modern-day cryptid sightings. But nothing quite matched what I had seen. I debated whether to share my story, knowing how insane it would sound to most people. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself, save for a few close friends who knew me well enough to know I wasn't prone to making up tales or exaggerating. But I've never forgotten that night on Lake Whisper. It changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I still go camping, still love the outdoors. But now, when I sit by a lake at night, I find myself scanning the water, wondering what might be lurking beneath the surface. And sometimes, when the moon is full and the night is quiet, I swear I can hear a distant splash and a low, rumbling growl carried on the wind. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what I saw that night, but I do know this. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that exist in the liminal spaces between what we know and what we fear. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just come face to face with them in the most unexpected places. So the next time you're camping by a quiet lake and you hear an unusual splash in the night, remember my story. And maybe think twice before dismissing it as just another fish jumping or a deer coming down to drink, because you never know what might be out there, watching and waiting in the depths. Story 17. The first sign that something was wrong came from the silence. Not the peaceful, tranquil silence you expect in the wilderness, but an oppressive, suffocating quiet that presses in from all sides. You don't notice it at first. You think maybe the wind died down or the birds took a break, but then it hits you. There are no sounds at all, no insects, no rustling leaves, nothing, just silence. And it's in that silence that fear starts to creep in. We had planned this hike for weeks, Brian, Danny and I, 3 friends who had been through plenty of trails together, but never one like this. The trail was way off the grid, tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where only the most serious hikers ever ventured. It was supposed to be a 3-day loop, rugged but rewarding, with sweeping views of the valleys below and towering peaks in the distance. We were looking for a challenge, and we definitely found one. But not the kind we expected. The first day went smoothly enough. We set out in the early morning, the sun just starting to climb over the horizon and the trail winding up through dense woods. The air was cool, and the promise of adventure had us in high spirits. We joked around, threw friendly jabs at each other, and kept a steady pace. There was nothing but trees, rocks, and the endless climb ahead. The kind of isolation that usually makes you feel alive, part of something bigger. But as the day wore on and the shadows grew longer, the atmosphere began to change. The trees felt like they were closing in, the air heavy, almost thick. The silence started to feel unnatural. Even Brian, who was always talking, cracked fewer jokes. We tried to ignore it, push through, but there was no denying that the woods were different here. We made camp that night near a small clearing, a flat stretch of land surrounded by towering pines. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. We ate, talked about the day, and tried to shake off the weird feeling that had settled over us. But even then, none of us could ignore the fact that something wasn't right. The quiet was all wrong. "Do you guys hear that?" Danny had said suddenly, breaking the silence. We paused, looking around. There was nothing, no wind, no insects, not even the distant hoot of an owl. "Yeah," Brian muttered, staring into the fire. "I've been noticing it for a while now. It's like everything stopped." I nodded, my eyes scanning the edge of the clearing. The trees loomed tall and black, their branches hanging still in the night air. No movement, no sound. "It's probably just the time of year," I said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe the animals have moved on, heading south for the winter." But I didn't believe my own words. The silence wasn't natural. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. We turned in early that night, hoping that some rest would shake off the unease. I crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable, but my mind kept spinning. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in around us. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a fitful sleep. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, like someone was moving slowly through the underbrush. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the shapes of the trees around us. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, circling our camp. I glanced over at Brian and Danny. Both of them were still, breathing steadily in their sleeping bags. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I held my breath, listening, waiting for something, anything. But all I heard was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Then suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the clearing, like a branch breaking under the weight of something large. I shot up, flashlight in hand, and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the dark. The light bounced off the trees, illuminating nothing but shadows and empty space. There was no one there. I stood up slowly, shining the light around the perimeter of our camp. The trees stood silent and still, towering over me like dark sentinels. But something had been there. I could feel it. "Jake, what the hell are you doing?" Brian's voice cut through the quiet, groggy and annoyed. "I heard something," I whispered, keeping the flashlight trained on the woods. "Footsteps. Something was walking around out here." Danny stirred, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "You sure it wasn't just an animal?" I shook my head, my pulse still racing. No, it was too heavy. We all sat in silence for a few moments, the tension hanging thick in the air. Eventually, Brian sighed and threw off his sleeping bag. "Let's check it out," he said, grabbing his own flashlight. "I'm not going back to sleep if there's something creeping around out here." Reluctantly, Danny and I joined him. We spread out a little, sweeping our flashlights through the trees, searching for any sign of movement. The night air was cold, biting against my skin as we moved further from the warmth of the fire. My breath came out in small puffs of mist, and my heart pounded in my chest. We didn't find anything, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to explain the sounds I'd heard. The woods were as still as ever, like the forest had swallowed up whatever had been there. After a few minutes, Brian let out a frustrated sigh. "Man, I think you just freaked yourself out. Let's get back to camp." But as we turned to head back, I caught sight of something. Just at the edge of the flashlight beam, something was lying on the ground, partially hidden by leaves and dirt. I stepped closer, my throat tightening. It was an animal carcass, a deer, or what was left of it. Its body had been torn open, ribs exposed, entrails scattered across the forest floor. The flesh looked fresh, like it had been killed recently, too recently. "Jesus," Danny whispered, his voice barely audible. What did that? None of us had an answer. We stood there staring at the mangled remains, the smell of blood thick in the air. Something had killed that deer, and it had done it right near our camp. Brian cleared his throat, his voice shaky. We should go back. Now." We didn't argue. We moved quickly, almost running, back to the safety of our campfire. None of us slept much after that. The rest of the night we sat huddled by the fire, flashlights in hand, listening to the silence pressing in around us. The next morning, we broke camp as soon as the sun came up. The air felt lighter in the daylight, but the unease never left. We didn't talk much as we packed up, but the tension hung heavy between us. None of us could shake what we had seen or heard. As we started back down the trail, the forest seemed more alive than it had the day before. The birds had returned, and the wind rustled through the trees, but it didn't bring the comfort I had hoped. The silence of the night still weighed on me, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching us from the trees. About halfway down the trail, we found more of the same. More carcasses torn apart, left in strange patterns along the path. Not just deer, but smaller animals too. Rabbits, raccoons, even a fox. It was like something had gone on a killing spree, but it wasn't eating the animals. It was leaving them, like a warning. We didn't linger. By the time we reached the trailhead, the tension between us had turned into an unspoken agreement. We weren't going to talk about what had happened. Not to each other, not to anyone. But I knew we were all thinking the same thing. Something was out there. Something bigger, something dangerous, and it was watching us. I haven't been back to that trail since. None of us have. Sometimes late at night when the world is quiet and the darkness feels just a little too thick, I think about the sounds I heard. The heavy footsteps, the snap of that branch, the way the forest held its breath. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting, listening, hunting. And I know, deep down, that it is. Story 18. I've spent my entire career studying the natural world, but nothing in my years of research could have prepared me for what I encountered in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. What began as a routine field study turned into a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about science and the creatures that inhabit our world. My name is Kevin, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large mammal behavior. For the past decade, I've been tracking and studying bear populations across North America. But it was during a research expedition in the dense forests of Washington state that I came face to face with something that defied all scientific explanation. It all started on a crisp autumn morning. I had been in the field for nearly 2 weeks, setting up camera traps and collecting data on the local black bear population. The forest was thick and primeval, with towering cedars and Douglas firs creating a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. It was the kind of wilderness that made you feel small, insignificant in the face of nature's grandeur. I had just finished checking a line of camera traps and was reviewing the footage on my laptop. Most of it was what I expected: bears foraging for berries, the occasional deer or elk passing by. But then I came across a series of images that made my blood run cold. It was taken in the middle of the night, the infrared sensor capturing a large bipedal creature moving through the frame. At first glance, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs. But as I zoomed in and enhanced the image, I realized this was something else entirely. The proportions were all wrong for a bear, the arms too long, the legs too straight. And the face, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Vaguely primate-like, but with features that seemed almost human. I sat there for a long time, staring at the image on my screen. My scientific mind raced to find a rational explanation. Could it be a hoax? A person in a costume? But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The way the creature moved, the musculature visible even in the grainy night vision footage, this was a living, breathing animal. One that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. I spent the next few days obsessively checking and rechecking my camera traps, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature, but it was as if it had vanished into thin air. I found a few ambiguous tracks, large humanoid footprints that were quickly erased by rain or animal activity, but nothing concrete enough to prove what I had seen. As the days wore on, I began to feel a constant sense of being watched. The forest, which had always been a place of comfort for me, now felt alien and threatening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard heavy footsteps outside my tent. But when I'd gather the courage to look, there was never anything there. It was on the 5th night after my initial discovery that everything changed. I was sitting by my campfire, poring over my field notes and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The night was unusually quiet. No owls hooting, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear's growl or a cougar's scream. It was something entirely different, something that sent a primal shiver of fear down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, at the edge of the beam, I saw movement. Something large was moving through the trees, just out of clear sight. I caught glimpses of dark fur, of long limbs moving with surprising grace for something so big. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But the scientist in me, the part that had devoted my life to understanding the natural world, kept me rooted to the spot. I had to know, had to see it clearly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to understand." For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the darkness, came a response. It wasn't words, not in any language I recognized, but it was undeniably communicative. A series of clicks, whoops, and low rumbles that seemed to convey curiosity and perhaps a warning. And then, it stepped into the light. I'd like to say I maintained my scientific detachment, that I calmly observed and noted every detail. But the truth is, I was terrified. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a body covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was a bizarre blend of ape-like features and something almost human, with deep-set eyes that reflected the firelight with an unsettling intelligence. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I was frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The creature tilted its head, studying me with an intensity that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. Then, without warning, it turned and melted back into the forest, moving with a speed and silence that seemed impossible for something so large. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where it had been, half convinced I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. The encounter was real as the trembling in my hands and the cold sweat on my brow. I had just come face to face with something that, by all scientific understanding, shouldn't exist. A creature that blurred the lines between known species, that raised profound questions about evolution and the history of life on our planet. The rest of my expedition passed in a blur. I was obsessed with finding more evidence, with proving to myself and the world that what I had seen was real. I combed through every frame of footage from my camera traps, analyzed every track and sign I could find in the forest, but the creature remained elusive, a shadow at the edge of perception. As I packed up my camp on the final day, I felt a mix of excitement and dread. I had data that could potentially revolutionize our understanding of wildlife in North America. But I also knew the skepticism and ridicule I would face if I went public with my findings. In the months that followed, I pored over my notes and footage, consulting with trusted colleagues and experts in various fields. Some were intrigued by what I had found, seeing the potential for a groundbreaking discovery. Others dismissed it outright, suggesting that stress and isolation had led me to misinterpret normal wildlife behavior. In the end, I decided to continue my research in secret. I've returned to those woods many times since that first encounter, each time hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature. I've had a few tantalizing moments, strange vocalizations in the night, fleeting shadows at the edge of my camp, but nothing as clear and undeniable as that first night. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I question whether it really happened. But then I look at the photos, at the data I've collected, and I know the truth. There's something out there, something that challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. As I sit here, writing this account, I can't help but wonder about the implications of what I've discovered. If this creature exists, what else might be out there, hidden in the vast wilderness areas of our world? How many other species have escaped scientific classification, living in the shadows of our understanding? I don't know if I'll ever find definitive proof, if I'll ever be able to share my discovery with the world. But I do know that my experience has forever changed the way I view the natural world. It's reminded me that there are still mysteries out there, still wonders to be uncovered. So the next time you're in the wilderness and you hear a strange sound or see a shadow that doesn't quite make sense, remember my story. Remember that the world is vast and full of secrets, and that sometimes, just sometimes, those secrets might be watching us back. Story 19. I've been a fishing guide for over 2 decades, but nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what happened that night on Whisper Lake. What started as a routine expedition turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams and makes me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trip, just me and a group of 5 eager anglers looking to catch some of the legendary trout that Whisper Lake is famous for. We'd done the safety briefing, packed our gear, and set out at dawn, the mist still clinging to the water's surface as we loaded up the boats. Whisper Lake is one of those places that feels untouched by time. Surrounded by dense forest and accessible only by a rough logging road, it's the kind of spot that hardcore fishermen dream about. The lake is deep, over 300 feet in some places, and there are stories of monster fish lurking in its depths. The first day went smoothly enough. We caught some decent-sized trout, nothing record-breaking, but enough to keep the group excited. As night fell, we made camp on a small island near the center of the lake. The mood was jovial as we sat around the campfire, swapping fishing stories and sipping whiskey under a sky full of stars. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that things started to feel off. I was awakened by a sound I couldn't quite place, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to be coming from the lake itself. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I sat up in my tent, I realized the sound was very real. I unzipped the tent flap and stepped out into the cool night air. The lake was unnaturally still, its surface like black glass reflecting the starlight. And there, just at the edge of visibility, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing an eerie green, just breaking the surface of the water. They formed a wide circle around our island, unblinking and fixed directly on our camp. I rubbed my eyes, certain I must be seeing things, but when I looked again, they were still there, and they were moving closer. My heart pounding, I quickly woke the others. At first, they were annoyed at being roused so early, but as I pointed out the eyes, their complaints turned to gasps of shock and fear. "What the hell are those?" whispered Mike, one of the younger guys in the group. "I don't know," I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady, "but we need to pack up now." We scrambled to break camp, throwing our gear haphazardly into bags. The eyes continued their slow approach, and now we could hear something else. A soft splashing, like multiple large bodies moving through water. Just as we finished loading the boats, one of the women in the group, Sarah, let out a scream. "Look!" she cried, pointing towards the shore. There, illuminated by our flashlights, was a sight that defied explanation. A massive serpentine neck rose from the water, easily 20 feet tall. At its top was a head that looked like a nightmarish blend of horse and alligator, with rows of gleaming teeth visible in its slightly open mouth. For a moment we all stood frozen, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very air around us, the creature lunged forward. "Go! Go!" I yelled, snapping out of my stupor. We piled into the boats, engines roaring to life as we sped away from the island. But we weren't fast enough. As we raced across the lake, I could hear the sound of something massive moving through the water behind us. I risked a glance back, and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature, or creatures, I couldn't be sure, were in pursuit, their long necks cutting through the water with terrifying speed. "Head for the shore!" I shouted over the roar of the engines. "We need to get out of the water!" We made for the nearest shoreline, a steep, rocky embankment that rose sharply from the lake. As we neared it, I could hear the creatures getting closer, their snorts and growls growing louder by the second. We hit the shore hard, the boat's hulls scraping against the rocks. "Everybody out!" I yelled, helping the others scramble onto land. We grabbed what gear we could and started climbing the embankment, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. Halfway up the slope, I heard a scream. I turned to see Mike, who had been at the rear of our group, being dragged back towards the water by something I couldn't quite make out in the darkness. Without thinking, I slid back down, grabbing his outstretched hand. For a moment, it was a tug-of-war between me and whatever had Mike. In the beam of my dropped flashlight, I caught a glimpse of a long, scaled arm ending in webbed claws. The smell of rotting fish filled my nostrils as I strained to pull Mike free. With a final heave, I managed to wrench him from the creature's grasp. We scrambled up the embankment, not stopping until we reached the tree line where the others were waiting. As we stood there, gasping for breath, a chorus of inhuman shrieks rose from the lake. The sounds were filled with frustration and hunger, sending chills down my spine. We didn't stick around to see if the creatures could follow us on land, instead plunging into the dense forest, guided only by the beam of a single surviving flashlight. We walked through the night, jumping at every sound, certain that at any moment we'd hear the crashing of massive bodies through the underbrush. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees that we finally allowed ourselves to stop and rest. As we sat there, exhausted and shell-shocked, the full impact of what we'd experienced began to sink in. We had encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that flew in the face of everything we thought we knew about the natural world. "What were those things?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. I shook my head. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've never seen or heard of anything like them." "We need to report this," said John, the oldest member of our group. "People need to know what's out there." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Who would believe us? We had no proof. In our panic, we'd left our cameras and phones back at the camp. We'd be labeled as crazy, our story dismissed as mass hysteria or a hoax. In the end, we agreed to keep what we'd seen to ourselves, at least until we could figure out how to prove it. We made our way back to civilization, concocting a story about bad weather forcing us to cut our trip short. In the weeks and months that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I pored over books on cryptozoology, on legends of lake monsters from around the world. I found hints and whispers, tales of strange creatures seen in remote lakes, of fishermen gone missing in calm waters, but nothing that fully matched what we'd encountered. I haven't been back to Whisper Lake since that night. My guiding business has suffered. I make excuses to avoid taking groups there, steering them towards safer, more familiar waters. But the truth is, I'm afraid of what might be lurking beneath those calm waters, waiting for its next meal. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I find myself drawn to the lakeshore near my home. I stand there, staring out at the dark water, half expecting to see those glowing eyes rise to the surface, and I wonder, are they out there in other lakes and rivers? How long have they existed alongside us, hidden in the depths? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at a body of water the same way again. Those dark depths hold secrets, ancient and terrifying. We like to think we've explored every corner of this world, that we understand all its wonders and horrors. But my experience taught me otherwise. There are things out there just beneath the surface, in the places we thought we knew. Things that remind us that we're not as far removed from the primal world as we'd like to believe. And sometimes, if the conditions are just right, we might catch a glimpse of them. Just hope they don't catch a glimpse of you. Story 20. It was the kind of place that made you question what you were doing out there in the first place. Tucked away deep in the forest, miles from any marked trail, the cabin looked like it hadn't seen a human being in years, maybe decades. The roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were nothing more than empty black holes staring out into the wilderness. The door was barely hanging on its rusted hinges, creaking in the wind like a low, warning groan. I didn't want to be there, not really, but it was my job. As a park ranger, I'd seen my fair share of strange things. People often think it's all about chasing bears off campsites and giving directions to lost hikers. But there's another side to it, the side where you go looking for what most people run away from. I was used to the isolation, the long hours out in the wild, but there was something different about this place. I could feel it the moment I stepped out of my truck. The call had come in earlier that morning. Reports of poachers or illegal campers had reached the station, and I'd been sent out to investigate. Normally, I'd have backup, but the guys were stretched thin, and this was supposed to be a routine check. No big deal. Get in, check it out, and head back before sundown. But standing there, staring at that decrepit cabin, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The forest around it was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. I radioed back to HQ. "John here. I've located the cabin. No signs of activity yet. Checking inside now." Static answered me. I frowned, tapping the radio. "HQ, do you copy?" More static. Great. Dead zone. I shoved the radio back on my belt and moved toward the cabin. The ground around the place was overgrown with weeds and brambles, but there was a path of sorts leading up to the door, trampled down, like someone had been walking through it recently. That put me on edge. This wasn't some forgotten relic. Someone had been here, maybe even recently. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the eerie quiet. I stepped inside, the air thick with the musty scent of rotting wood and damp earth. The place was dark, even with the sunlight streaming through the broken windows. My boots thudded softly against the uneven floor as I swept my flashlight around the room. It was a single space, not much to it. A broken table leaned against the far wall, chairs overturned and splintered across the floor. The walls were marked with long, jagged scratches, like something had tried to tear its way through the wood. I knelt down, running my fingers over the grooves. They were deep, deliberate. Whatever had made them, it wasn't human. My breath caught as my flashlight passed over something in the corner. Bones. I stood up slowly, heart thudding in my chest, and took a closer look. It wasn't human, at least I didn't think so. A deer, maybe, or some other animal. But the way the bones were scattered, broken, something had torn this thing apart. There was no clean kill here, no precision, just raw, savage destruction. I turned my gaze back to the scratches on the walls, then to the broken furniture. This wasn't the work of some poacher or illegal camper. Something else had been here, and it didn't feel like it had left. The air inside the cabin was suffocating, thick with the scent of decay. I forced myself to breathe, to keep moving. I needed to figure out what had happened here, but every instinct was telling me to leave. Now. I made my way to the small, rotting door at the back of the cabin. The hinges were rusted, and I had to shove it hard to get it open. It led into a tiny room, barely big enough to be called a closet, but there was something off about it. The floorboards here looked newer, like someone had replaced them recently. Kneeling down, I pressed my hand against the boards. They were loose. A small, cold draft seeped through the cracks, brushing against my fingertips. Slowly, carefully, I pried one of the boards up. Beneath it was a dark hole, leading down into the earth. My flashlight beam disappeared into the blackness, revealing a small, narrow tunnel that led under the cabin. I couldn't see how far it went, but I had the sinking feeling that whatever had made those scratches, whatever had torn apart that deer, had come from down there. I was about to back away when I heard it. A low, guttural growl. It came from the hole, deep and rumbling, like something waking up. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. The growl grew louder, echoing up from the tunnel, and then I heard the scrape of claws against stone. Whatever was down there, it was moving. I didn't wait to see what it was. I scrambled to my feet, sprinting for the front door. My boot caught on a broken chair, sending me crashing to the floor. Pain shot through my knee, but I didn't stop. I could hear the thing now, crawling up through the tunnel, its growls growing more intense, more vicious. I yanked the door open just as I heard the thing reach the surface. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, sprinting across the overgrown path and into the trees. Branches whipped against my face, the underbrush snagging at my pants. But I didn't slow down. I could hear it behind me now, crashing through the woods, its breath heavy and ragged. I wasn't sure what it was. Part of me didn't want to know, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on me. It was close, too close. The trail ahead of me twisted and turned, the trees growing thicker and more oppressive. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. I knew if I did, that thing would be on me in seconds. I glanced back, just for a second, and my blood turned to ice. I couldn't see it clearly, just a dark, hulking shape moving through the trees. It was massive, its body low to the ground, covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, reflecting the fear that was coursing through me. I pushed harder, my legs trembling with exhaustion, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest was a blur around me, the world narrowing to the sound of my own heartbeat and the heavy, crashing footsteps behind me. Suddenly, the trees opened up, and I stumbled into a clearing. My truck was there, parked at the edge, the last piece of civilization between me and whatever was hunting me. I fumbled for my keys, yanking them out of my pocket as I sprinted toward the truck. The thing behind me let out a deafening roar, and I felt its presence closing in, the ground trembling beneath its weight. I reached the truck, throwing myself into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut, just as something massive collided with the side of the vehicle. The truck rocked violently, but I didn't stop. I jammed the keys into the ignition, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction and launching me forward. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove like a madman, tearing down the rough dirt road, the creature's roars fading into the distance behind me. My hands were clenched tight around the wheel, my heart still pounding in my chest as I sped away from that cursed cabin. I didn't stop driving until I reached the ranger station, the familiar sight of the building finally letting me breathe again. I stumbled out of the truck, legs shaking, and made my way inside. When the other rangers asked me what had happened, I couldn't tell them. Not really, who would believe me? But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back to that cabin. Whatever was under there, it wasn't done hunting. Story 21. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, monsters, things that go bump in the night. I dismissed them all as products of overactive imaginations. But after what happened during that camping trip in the Adirondacks, I'm not so sure anymore. Some sounds once heard can never be unheard, and some sights once seen will haunt you forever. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. Just me, my tent, and the vast wilderness of upstate New York. I'd chosen a remote spot, miles from the nearest marked campground, eager to escape the noise and stress of city life. As I set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was exactly what I needed. The first day was perfect. I hiked, fished in a nearby stream, and spent the evening watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. As night fell, I built a small fire and settled in with a book, enjoying the quiet broken only by the crackling of flames and the occasional hoot of an owl. It wasn't until well after midnight that things started to feel off. I was jolted awake by a sound I couldn't quite place, a high-pitched keening that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but the air was still, the trees motionless in the moonlight. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cool night air, straining my ears. The sound came again, louder this time. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. It raised the hair on the back of my neck and sent a shiver down my spine. Then, in the distance, I saw movement, a tall, thin figure moving between the trees with an unnatural grace. In the dim moonlight, I could make out long, gangly limbs and what looked like antlers protruding from its head. For a moment, I thought it might be a deer, but its movements were all wrong, too fluid, too deliberate. My heart pounding, I reached for my flashlight. As the beam cut through the darkness, the figure vanished, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. But the sounds continued, growing louder and more numerous. It was as if the forest itself had come alive with whispers and cries. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation and darkness were playing tricks on my mind. But as I stood there, rooted to the spot, a new smell hit me, the unmistakable stench of decay, like rotting meat left in the sun. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping just behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something that turned my blood to ice. A face, pale and gaunt, with eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow. It was there and gone in an instant, but the image burned itself into my memory. Panic seized me. I scrambled back into my tent, zipping it up as if the thin fabric could offer any real protection. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help. But of course, there was no signal out here. I was alone. The sounds outside grew louder, closer. I could hear movement all around my tent, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, and underneath it all, that constant eerie whispering. It was as if a crowd of people were just outside, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. Then silence fell. A silence so complete and sudden that it was almost more terrifying than the noise had been. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound at all. Nothing. Slowly, cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out. The clearing was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized something was very, very wrong. The trees had changed. Where before there had been normal pines, now stood twisted, gnarled trunks that seemed to lean in towards my tent. Their branches reached out like grasping fingers, and faces, horrible, tortured faces, seemed to peer out from the bark. I blinked hard, certain I must be hallucinating. But when I opened my eyes, the grotesque forest remained. And there, at the edge of the clearing, stood the figure I'd seen earlier. In the moonlight, I could see it clearly now. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with a body that was impossibly thin and covered in what looked like patchy fur. Its head was adorned with massive antlers, like those of an ancient elk. But its face was almost human, with sunken cheeks and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intelligence. Our gazes met, and in that moment I felt something I can't quite explain, a sense of ancient wisdom, of primal power, and underneath it all, a hunger that sent chills down my spine. This wasn't just some animal. This was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in this world. It took a step forward, its movements fluid and silent. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was frozen in place, transfixed by those glowing eyes. As it neared my tent, I could smell that overwhelming scent of decay again, so strong it made my eyes water. Just as I was certain it was about to reach for me, a sound broke the silence, a distant howl that echoed through the twisted forest. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, and for a moment it seemed almost afraid. With a speed that defied its size, it turned and loped back into the woods, disappearing among the grotesque trees. As soon as it was gone, the whispering started again, rising to a fevered pitch that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. I don't remember much of what happened next. I know I ran, abandoning my tent and most of my gear. I crashed through the forest, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and the roots that threatened to trip me. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to find my way back to civilization and sanity. As I ran, the forest around me seemed to shift and change. One moment, I was pushing through twisted, nightmarish trees. The next, I was in a normal pine forest. The whispers faded, replaced by the usual sounds of the night woods. By the time I stumbled onto a marked trail, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. I made my way back to my car in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as a vivid nightmare or some kind of stress-induced hallucination, but the scratches on my arms and face, the leaves tangled in my hair, told a different story. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into research, searching for any explanation for what I'd encountered. I found fragments of old legends, tales of the Wendigo, of forest spirits that lured travelers to their doom. But nothing quite matched the terrifying beauty of the creature I'd seen. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? I'd be labeled a hysteric or a liar. But I know what I saw was real. It had looked into my eyes with an intelligence that was undeniably self-aware. And for reasons I still can't fathom, it had chosen to let me go. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself drawn to the wilderness more than ever, but now there's an edge to my adventures, a heightened awareness of the shadows between the trees. I listen more closely to the sounds of the forest, always half expecting to hear that eerie whispering again. Sometimes, when I'm hiking in remote areas, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of my vision, a tall, thin shape that vanishes when I turn to look directly at it. And for a moment, I'll feel that same mix of terror and awe that I felt that night in the Adirondacks. One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Those dark forests hold secrets, ancient and wild. We like to think we've mapped every inch of this world, that we understand all its wonders and terrors. But my experience taught me otherwise. There are things out there, just beyond the reach of our campfires and the beam of our flashlights, things that remind us that we're not as far removed from the primal world as we'd like to believe. And sometimes, if the conditions are just right, we might catch a glimpse of them. Just hope they don't decide to do more than whisper.